Hello everyone. I know you used this video to fall asleep, but before you do, let me know where you're from and what time you're watching. Now just get cozy and enjoy. It all started with that letter. A simple, unmarked envelope slipped into our mailbox with no return address. Just my name and Sarah's, scrawled in a shaky, almost desperate handwriting. I don't know why, but I felt uneasy as I held it in my hands, the weight of it light but the sensation heavy. Inside, the message was brief, blunt, and unsettling. Do not go to the old lighthouse on Brighton Cliff. It's not safe. No signature. No explanation. Just a warning that sent a chill down my spine. What do you think it means? Sarah asked, holding the note at arm's length, as though it could bite her. Her blue eyes darted from the paper to me, her brow furrowed in confusion. I didn't have an answer. But of course, curiosity has a way of getting the better of us. The letter had the opposite effect of what it intended. It sparked something inside us. The lighthouse hadn't been in use for decades. Brighton Cliff was just a rocky outcrop, abandoned and forgotten, barely a blip on the radar of our small town. Who would care if we went there? We should check it out, I said, the words slipping out before I could stop myself. I could see the flicker of doubt in Sarah's eyes, but it quickly morphed into something else. Adventure. I mean, why not? She shrugged, slipping the letter into her pocket. If there's something to be scared of, we'll just leave, right? Famous last words. That evening, as the sun began to set and cast the town in a warm orange glow, we packed a small bag and made our way to Brighton Cliff. I don't know what we were expecting. A trap, maybe. Some prank? Perhaps an old urban legend brought to life. But the road there was quiet, save for the rustling leaves in the wind and the distant crashing of waves. The closer we got to the cliff, the more I noticed how everything felt off. The air seemed thicker, heavier, like walking through molasses. I tried to brush it off, attributing it to nerves. Maybe I was just psyching myself out, but Sarah, she seemed unfazed. We're probably the first people to visit this place in years, she said, almost cheerfully. But the cheer didn't last long. The lighthouse soon loomed before us, towering against the twilight sky like a skeletal giant, its rusted frame creaking ever so slightly in the wind. A chain-link fence that had once cordoned off the area lay flat on the ground, the padlock broken. Whoever sent us that letter didn't seem too concerned about people staying away. I felt a strange compulsion to keep going, despite the warning. My heart pounded in my chest, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but my feet kept moving. It's just an old building, Sarah said, trying to sound confident, but I could hear the tremor in her voice. The door to the lighthouse was ajar, swinging on rusty hinges, inviting us in. The inside was dark, the only light filtering in through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The air smelled stale, like salt water and something older, something decayed. We should have left right then and there. Every instinct in my body told me to turn around to run, but we didn't. Maybe it was the letter, maybe it was our own curiosity, but we pushed forward, deeper into the dark belly of the lighthouse. At the base of the spiral staircase, I saw something. A smear of red on the wall, like dried blood, leading upwards. My stomach churned. Sarah, I started, but she was already ahead of me, climbing the steps. The higher we went, the more oppressive the air became. Each step creaked under our weight, echoing in the emptiness. I swear I heard whispers, just faint enough to make me doubt whether they were real or just my imagination. Do you hear that? I asked, stopping halfway up the staircase. Hear what? Sarah's voice echoed back down. She hadn't noticed anything. I shook my head, convincing myself I was just being paranoid. But then I saw it, movement. A shadow darting past the top of the stairs. We should go, I said, my voice more forceful now. We've seen enough. But Sarah ignored me, reaching the top first. I followed, my heart pounding in my ears. The room at the top of the lighthouse was small, circular, and empty, except for a large mirror propped up against the far wall. It was old, the glass mottled with age, but something about it drew me in. I stepped closer, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There was something wrong with my reflection. It wasn't just the distortion from the age of the mirror, no, it was something else. Something moved behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. Sarah stood by the window, staring out at the cliffs below. "Look at this view," she said quietly, but her voice didn't sound right. It was distant, hollow. I turned back to the mirror, and that's when I saw it. There, standing right behind Sarah in the reflection, was a figure. Tall, shrouded in darkness, its face obscured. My breath caught in my throat. I spun around again, but the room was empty. "Sarah," I whispered, panic rising in my chest. "We need to leave. Now." But she didn't respond. She just kept staring out the window, her body unnaturally still. I grabbed her arm, pulling her away from the window, but the moment I touched her, a jolt of cold shot through me, freezing my blood. Her skin was like ice. "Sarah," I shouted now, shaking her. Finally, she turned to face me. Her eyes were vacant, her expression blank. She wasn't Sarah anymore. What's happening?" I stumbled back, my voice trembling. Her mouth moved, but the words that came out weren't hers. They were the same words from the letter. "It's not safe." And then everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the cold, hard floor of the lighthouse. My head throbbed, and the taste of metal filled my mouth. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and something rotten. The darkness was suffocating, pressing in on me from every angle. For a moment, I thought it had all been a dream. But when I tried to stand, my legs wobbled beneath me, and I stumbled against the wall, catching my breath. Sarah was nowhere in sight. "Sarah?" My voice cracked as I called her name. The only response was the eerie creaking of the lighthouse and the distant crash of the waves below. I fumbled in my pocket for my phone, praying for a signal, but the screen was cracked, and it wouldn't turn on. Desperation clawed at my throat. I had to find her. I had to get out of this place. The stairs creaked as I descended, each step echoing like a hammer against my skull. My mind was racing, trying to piece together what had happened. Sarah's vacant eyes, the figure in the mirror, none of it made sense. At the bottom of the stairs, I found the front door slightly ajar, swaying in the wind. I stepped outside, and the cold night air hit me like a slap in the face. The moon hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the cliffside. And then I saw her. Sarah was standing near the edge of the cliff, her back to me, staring out at the dark expanse of the sea. I called her name again, louder this time, but she didn't move. Fear knotted in my stomach as I approached her, the ground crunching beneath my feet. When I was only a few feet away, she finally spoke. "I saw them," she whispered, her voice hollow, as though she was speaking from somewhere far away. "Saw who?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest. She turned to face me, and I felt my blood run cold. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, but it was the expression of pure terror etched into her features that froze me in place. "The people in the mirror," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. "They were watching us." I opened my mouth to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. There was something horribly wrong with her, something I couldn't explain. I reached out to take her hand, to pull her away from the edge, but as soon as I touched her, she let out a blood-curdling scream. Her body jerked violently, her limbs thrashing as though something invisible had grabbed hold of her. I tried to hold on, to pull her back, but she slipped from my grasp and fell to the ground, convulsing. "Sarah!" I shouted, dropping to my knees beside her. I didn't know what to do. I was powerless, watching as the love of my life twisted and writhed on the ground, her eyes rolling back in her head. And then, as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. She lay still, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. I leaned over her, shaking her gently. "Sarah?" I whispered. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a brief moment, I thought everything might be okay. But then she smiled. It wasn't a smile I recognized. It was cold, cruel, and far too wide for her face. "What's wrong, darling?" she asked, her voice dripping with malice. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. "You're not Sarah," I said, my voice trembling. She stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from her clothes, her movements unnaturally graceful. "No," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "I'm not." Panic surged through me as I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the thing that wore Sarah's face. "What do you want?" I demanded, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. It tilted its head, as though considering the question. "You shouldn't have come here," it said, taking a step toward me. "You were warned." I glanced around, searching for a way out, but the cliff was too steep, and the lighthouse loomed behind me like a prison. There was nowhere to run. "What happened to her?" I asked, my voice breaking. "Where's Sarah?" The thing smiled again, that same twisted grin. "She's still here," it said, tapping its temple. "In here. But she's not in control anymore." My stomach turned, and I felt bile rising in my throat. "Let her go," I pleaded. "Please." It laughed, a low, guttural sound that sent shivers down my spine. "It's too late for that," it said. "You've seen too much." And then, in the blink of an eye, it lunged at me. I barely had time to react, throwing myself to the side as it slammed into the ground where I had been standing. I scrambled to my feet, my heart racing, and ran toward the lighthouse. But as soon as I reached the door, it slammed shut on its own, locking me out. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but I knew deep down that no one would come. When I turned around, Sarah, or whatever was controlling her, was standing right behind me. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice dripping with malice. "You never could." I backed up against the door, my mind racing. I needed to think, to figure out a way to get out of this nightmare. But before I could do anything, it grabbed me by the throat, lifting me off the ground with inhuman strength. "I'll show you what happens to those who don't listen," it hissed, its face inches from mine. And then, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the ground near the cliff's edge again, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. My body ached, my throat raw from the pressure. I struggled to sit up, my head spinning, and looked around. Sarah was gone. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the spot where she had stood, my mind numb with shock. It felt like hours, but it could have been minutes. Time seemed meaningless. Finally, I forced myself to my feet and stumbled back to the car. I didn't look back at the lighthouse. I couldn't. The drive home was a blur, the roads winding and empty, just like my thoughts. I don't remember parking the car or walking into the house, but the next thing I knew, I was standing in the living room, staring blankly at the clock on the wall. It was over, but Sarah was gone, and I had no idea how to explain what had happened. Who would believe me anyway? Days turned into weeks, and I tried to move on, to convince myself that it had all been some horrible nightmare. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her real face, not the one that thing had worn. And I heard her voice, whispering to me from the darkness. The letter had warned us not to go to the lighthouse. We should have listened. But we didn't. And now I'm alone. A few months after Sarah's disappearance, I received another letter in the mail. This one had no return address, just like the first. My hands shook as I opened it, dread pooling in my stomach. Inside, there was a single sentence. "You're next." I had just gotten the job, a caretaker for an old woman living alone in a massive, decaying mansion on the edge of town. The pay was good, and the work seemed simple enough. Mrs. Lorraine was in her late 80s, with no family left to visit her. I arrived at the mansion on a chilly, overcast evening, the wind howling through the trees that surrounded the place. As I approached, the iron gates creaked open by themselves, almost as if the house was expecting me. The mansion stood like a forgotten relic, its walls covered in vines, windows dark and lifeless. But it was the inside that unnerved me most. The air was thick, almost suffocating, with a coldness that seemed to cling to my skin. The dimly lit hallways stretched out like endless tunnels, their shadows dancing with each flicker of light. Mrs. Lorraine was a frail woman, her skin paper thin, her eyes clouded with age. She was sitting in an old wooden chair by the fireplace when I first met her. She didn't smile, didn't acknowledge me as people usually do. Instead, her first words were chilling. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered, her voice raspy and hollow. "I'm here to help you, Mrs. Lorraine," I replied, trying to stay calm. She turned her head slowly to face me, her eyes piercing into mine. "I don't need your help. I'm already dead." I froze. Was she suffering from dementia? The agency hadn't mentioned any mental issues, but the way she said it, it felt so final. That night, as I settled into my room, I couldn't shake her words from my mind. The mansion creaked and groaned, like it was alive, breathing. Around midnight, I heard soft footsteps outside my door. Thinking it was Mrs. Lorraine, I peeked out, but no one was there. Over the next few days, things got stranger. I'd find objects moved, doors I had locked wide open, and whispers, faint, almost too quiet to hear, floating through the halls. Mrs. Lorraine never left her chair, never moved except to turn her head slightly toward the windows, as if watching for something. One afternoon, I explored the house. It was filled with dusty, forgotten relics of the past. But one thing caught my eye, a portrait hanging in the hallway. It was of a younger woman, her face eerily similar to Mrs. Lorraine's. But what unnerved me most was the signature at the bottom. It was dated 1925. I confronted Mrs. Lorraine about it. "That's you, isn't it? But this painting is nearly a century old." She stared into the fire, her face expressionless. "I told you I'm already dead. This place, it doesn't let go of the past." As the days wore on, I began to see them, shadowy figures in the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. They didn't move like people. They flickered like memories trapped in time. One night, I woke up to find one standing at the foot of my bed. It didn't speak, didn't move, just watched. I bolted from the bed, running through the mansion's maze-like halls. But no matter where I went, I felt their presence, always just behind me. Desperate for answers, I ventured into the basement, a place Mrs. Lorraine had warned me to stay away from. The air down there was thick with rot, the walls damp and covered in mold. At the far end, I found a door, locked, but not securely. I pushed it open. Inside was a small room, bare except for a bed and a pile of old newspapers. The headlines chilled me. "Woman found dead in mansion fire, 1926. The picture was unmistakable. It was Mrs. Lorraine. The article detailed how she had died tragically in a fire that had consumed most of the house. But then how was she still here? I confronted her again, showing her the article. Her face didn't change. "This house," she said softly, "it holds onto the souls of the dead. It doesn't let us leave." I realized then that she wasn't just claiming to be dead. She truly was, and I was trapped here with her. That night, the shadows came again, more of them this time, crowding the room. Mrs. Lorraine sat in her chair, watching them as if she knew what was coming. I tried to run, but the house twisted around me, doors leading to nowhere, windows showing nothing but darkness. And then I heard her voice, soft and distant. "You can't leave. Not now. You belong here." The last thing I remember was her cold hand on my shoulder, pulling me into the darkness. The house had claimed me, just like it had claimed her. Now I sit here, waiting for the next caretaker to arrive, knowing they won't believe me when I tell them I'm already dead. The last thing I remember was Mrs. Lorraine's cold hand resting on my shoulder, her voice like a distant echo, pulling me further into the mansion's suffocating darkness. The house had claimed me, just like it had claimed her. But the shadows, they were no longer content with staying in the corners. They closed in, suffocating me with their weight, pressing against my chest until I couldn't breathe. And then, nothing. I woke up the next morning, sunlight streaming through the window as if nothing had happened. The shadows were gone, and the mansion was quiet, eerily quiet. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. Had it all been a nightmare? A trick of my mind? But when I looked into the mirror, I froze. My reflection wasn't my own. It was Mrs. Lorraine's face, staring back at me with cold, empty eyes. Panic set in, and I bolted from the room, desperate to find her, to demand answers. But as I ran through the hallways, something terrifying became clear. The house had changed. The walls were no longer familiar. The doors led to rooms I had never seen before, and the windows no longer showed the outside world, just endless blackness. I called out for help, but my voice echoed back at me, swallowed by the silence of the mansion. Mrs. Lorraine's voice drifted through the air, soft and mocking. "You're one of us now. This house, it takes what it wants." Desperation clawed at me as I searched for an exit, but no matter where I went, I always ended up back in the same room, the one with the mirror. Mrs. Lorraine's reflection stared at me, smiling now. A twisted, knowing smile. I smashed the mirror, glass shards scattering across the floor, but when I looked up, she was still there, her face reflected in every piece of broken glass. Days turned into weeks, or maybe it was hours. Time didn't exist here anymore. I wandered the endless halls, my mind unraveling with each passing moment. The shadows whispered my name, but I no longer feared them. They were a part of me now, just as I was a part of the house. Then one evening, as I sat in Mrs. Lorraine's chair by the fireplace, I heard the front door creak open. Footsteps echoed down the hall, and a figure appeared, a new caretaker. They looked just as confused and unsettled as I had been when I first arrived. "I'm here to take care of Mrs. Lorraine," they said, their voice uncertain. I smiled, a cold, empty smile, the same one Mrs. Lorraine had given me all those weeks ago. "You shouldn't have come," I whispered. "I'm already dead." The new caretaker froze, just as I had, staring at me with a mix of fear and disbelief. I stood, feeling the weight of the house press down on me, knowing what was coming next. And then, just as they started to back away, the front door slammed shut behind them. I could hear it, the house's low, hungry hum. It wanted them, just like it had wanted me. But here's the thing. I didn't feel trapped anymore. No, I felt something else, something far darker. The house wasn't just a prison, it was alive. It was feeding off us, drawing us in one by one. I glanced down at my hands and saw them slowly fading, becoming part of the shadows that filled this cursed mansion. And then I realized something that sent a chill through me, something far more terrifying than anything I had faced before. I wasn't alone in here. Somewhere, deep within the walls, there were others. They had always been here, watching, waiting. And now, I was one of them. But there was still one thing left, a question burning in my mind as I faded into the darkness. If I'm already dead, then who's watching me? I wasn't sure why we bought the house. It was older than most in the neighborhood, sitting at the edge of a woodline where the sun never quite hit in the late afternoon. Maybe it was the low price. Or maybe it was the fact that every other place seemed too polished, too perfect. Laura loved the charm, the squeaky wooden floors, the vintage wallpaper peeling in places. We'd been looking for something with character, and this one, well, it had plenty. But then there was the basement. It started innocently enough. On move-in day, we were excited, exploring every nook. But when we went down to the basement, something about it felt wrong. The space was cold, and not just because it was underground. It was darker than it should have been, like the shadows stuck to the corners. And then we saw it. A door, tucked away in the far corner of the basement. It didn't match the rest of the place, heavy and wooden, with iron hinges that looked as if they'd been hammered in by hands centuries ago. Laura and I tried to open it, of course. At first, we thought maybe it was a storage room, but there was no lock, no handle even. It didn't budge. When we knocked on it, the sound was hollow. Not like it hit wood, but like there was nothing behind it. It was weird, but we shrugged it off. Maybe it was a design quirk from back when houses were built differently. We laughed about it, joked that we had our own personal haunted door. But that night, the knocking started. At first, we thought it was the house settling, that old excuse. Houses creak, right? But this was different. It was rhythmic. Like someone or something was tapping softly at first, then louder, as if it wanted to come through. We didn't sleep well. The knocking continued each night, always starting around midnight. Every time we would get out of bed, rush downstairs, and stand in front of the door, trying to listen through the wood. But no matter how close we got, it always sounded far away. Like whatever was knocking wasn't on the other side of the door. It was beyond that, somewhere deeper. The knocking didn't stop. Each night, it grew louder, more insistent. Laura tried to brush it off at first. She'd tell me it was just the pipes or maybe a raccoon stuck in the walls. But I could see it in her eyes, the fear. She was as freaked out as I was. After a week of sleepless nights, I couldn't take it anymore. I decided to do something about it. "I'm going to pry it open," I told Laura one night after the knocking woke us up again. She didn't argue, just nodded, her lips pressed together in that worried way she did when she didn't want to admit she was scared. I grabbed a crowbar from the garage. My hands were shaking, but I wasn't about to let some strange old door drive me out of my own house. Laura stood at the top of the basement stairs, her face half hidden in the shadows. "Be careful," she whispered. The basement felt colder than usual. The door seemed to loom larger in the dark. As I wedged the crowbar into the small gap between the door and the frame, I half expected the wood to crumble. It was so old after all. But no, it held firm, almost like it was resisting. "Come on," I muttered, gritting my teeth as I pressed harder. Suddenly, there was a loud crack. The sound echoed through the basement. The door shifted just slightly, enough for a rush of air to escape from behind it. The smell hit me first, damp, stale, like the air had been trapped for centuries. I stumbled back coughing. "What is it?" Laura called from the stairs. I don't know," I said, my voice hoarse. I took a step closer, shining my flashlight into the tiny gap. Nothing, just darkness. Pure, empty darkness. For a moment, I felt this pull, like something was urging me to open the door wider to step through. But then the knocking started again, louder than ever, right next to my ear. I dropped the crowbar and stumbled back, nearly tripping over the old wooden beams on the floor. "I can't do this," I said, backing away from the door, my heart pounding in my chest. "I can't open it." Laura hurried down the stairs, grabbing my arm. "We need to call someone." "A contractor, maybe. Someone who can figure out what's behind it." We didn't touch the door again that night. The next morning, Laura called a local handyman to take a look. He was a gruff older man named Hank, with the kind of face that looked like it had seen too much. He didn't seem fazed when we told him about the door. "Seen plenty of weird things in old houses," he said, scratching his chin. "Probably just leads to some old crawl space or something." When he walked into the basement, though, his confidence seemed to falter. Hank ran his hand along the frame, inspecting the door closely. "Strange," he muttered. "This wood doesn't match anything else in the house. Looks a lot older, like it was added on afterward." "Can you open it?" Laura asked, her voice tense. Hank nodded and got to work. He had tools that looked more heavy-duty than my little crowbar, and for a while, he worked in silence, chiseling at the frame, prying the door loose bit by bit. Then, just as he was about to pull it open, he stopped. His hand hovered over the door handle, and his face went pale. "Something's not right here," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" I asked, stepping closer. "This door, it's cold. But not like normal cold. Feels wrong." He pulled his hand back, as if the door had burned him. "I don't think you should open it." Laura and I exchanged glances. "Why not?" I asked. Hank looked at us, his eyes wide. "Sometimes things are better left alone." That night, the knocking was louder than ever. It felt like the entire house was shaking. Laura and I huddled together in bed, terrified. Every knock seemed to vibrate through the walls, through the floor, through us. "We should have listened to him," Laura whispered, her voice trembling. "We should have left it alone." But we hadn't. We had disturbed whatever was behind that door, and now it wanted out. The following days were unbearable. The knocking wasn't just confined to the night anymore. We heard it during the day too, echoing up from the basement no matter where we were in the house. And it wasn't just knocking anymore. Sometimes we heard scratching, like nails dragging across the wood, and faint whispers, too low to make out the words. We stopped going into the basement. Every time I thought about that door, I felt sick to my stomach. It wasn't just fear, it was something deeper, something primal. Laura started having nightmares. She would wake up in the middle of the night, screaming, clutching at her chest, saying she couldn't breathe. I wasn't sleeping either. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard the knocking. And with each passing night, it felt like whatever was behind that door was getting closer, like it was slowly making its way toward us. Then one night, it stopped. We woke up to silence. No knocking, no scratching, no whispers. Just nothing. At first, we thought it was over. Maybe whatever it was had given up, had left. We tried to go back to our routine, pretending that everything was normal. But the silence was worse. Because we knew it was still there waiting. A week later, it happened. Laura was in the kitchen making coffee when I heard her scream. I ran downstairs, heart pounding, and found her standing at the basement door. It was open, not the strange door in the basement door itself, the one leading down to it. "I didn't open it," Laura said, her voice shaking. I swear I didn't. We both stood there, staring down into the darkness. For a moment, neither of us moved. Then slowly we heard it, the knocking, but it wasn't coming from the basement anymore. It was coming from right behind us. We turned around, and there it was, the door from the basement, standing in the middle of our living room, propped up against the wall like it had been there all along. There was no way it could have moved on its own, no way it could be in the house. And then the knocking started again, louder than ever, shaking the walls, the floor, everything. It wasn't just knocking anymore. It was banging, relentless, like whatever was behind it was furious, desperate to get through. Laura grabbed my arm. "We have to get out of here," she whispered, her face pale with terror. But before we could move, the door creaked open just a sliver and cold air rushed into the room, freezing us in place. I wish I could say we ran, that we got out of the house and never looked back. But we didn't. We couldn't. The door, it wouldn't let us leave. And now, every night, we hear the knocking. But it's not coming from the basement anymore. It's coming from inside the house. The banging continued for hours that night, but we didn't move. We stood frozen, clutching each other, staring at the door that now dominated the living room. The air was cold, so cold that I could see our breath. Laura's hand was trembling in mine, and I was too terrified to comfort her. The door hadn't moved again since it opened slightly, but we could feel something, a presence, just beyond it. It was as if something was watching us, waiting for us to make the next move. But we didn't. Eventually, the banging stopped. Silence filled the house once again, but it was heavier now, suffocating. Laura collapsed onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. "I can't do this anymore," she sobbed. "We need to leave. We need to get out of this house." I wanted to agree. I wanted to pack up everything and run, but something inside me, some dark, inexplicable force, made me hesitate. I couldn't leave. Not yet. "We'll go," I said, trying to soothe her. "First thing in the morning, okay?" But deep down, I knew that wasn't going to happen. That night, I couldn't sleep. The air in the house felt thick, oppressive, like it was pressing down on us, forcing us to stay awake. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening for the familiar knocking, but it didn't come. Instead, there was a whisper. It started softly at first, almost like a distant breeze, but it grew louder and louder until it was unmistakable. A voice, low and raspy, calling out my name. "Come?" I sat up, my heart racing, and looked over at Laura. She was fast asleep, her chest rising and falling rhythmically, oblivious to the sound. The whisper echoed again, closer this time. "Come to me." I didn't want to go. I didn't want to follow the voice, but something inside me was pulling me out of bed, guiding me toward the door. My feet moved on their own, quietly padding down the hallway, down the stairs, into the living room. The door was there, waiting for me. Its wooden surface gleamed in the pale moonlight, the iron hinges casting long shadows on the floor. And then, as if it had been waiting all along, the door creaked open just wide enough for me to see beyond it. I don't know what I expected to see on the other side. Darkness maybe, or nothing at all. But what I saw made my blood run cold. It was me. Or at least it looked like me. A twisted, distorted version of myself, standing in the dark beyond the door, its eyes gleaming with malice. It smiled at me, a cruel, sharp-toothed grin that made my stomach churn. "Come," it whispered, its voice like nails scraping against glass. "Join me." I tried to back away, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. I was trapped, frozen in place, staring at the thing that wore my face. And then, without warning, it lunged at me, its hand shooting out from behind the door. Cold fingers wrapped around my wrist, pulling me toward the darkness, toward whatever lay beyond that door. I fought it. God, I tried to fight it. But the more I struggled, the stronger it became. The world around me started to blur, the edges of the living room fading into the dark abyss behind the door. I could hear it now, the knocking again, pounding in my head, louder and louder with each passing second. The door was swallowing me. I don't remember how I got free. The next thing I knew, I was lying on the floor of the living room, gasping for air. The door was shut, but my wrist, where it had grabbed me, was ice cold, with a deep bruise already forming. Laura was shaking me awake, tears streaming down her face. "Why did you go down there?" she cried. "I heard you. I heard you talking to someone." I don't know," I muttered, still in shock. It was me. I saw myself. It tried to pull me in. Laura's eyes widened in terror, and she backed away from me as if I were a stranger. "What do you mean, it was you?" I didn't have an answer. I didn't understand it myself. We didn't wait until morning. Laura insisted we leave right away, and for once I didn't argue. We packed only what we could carry, leaving the rest behind. I didn't even lock the front door. I just wanted to get as far away from that place as possible. As we drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the house. It sat there, silent, the windows dark and lifeless. But in the moonlight, I could see the outline of the basement door, still standing in the living room, slightly ajar. I turned away, focusing on the road ahead, but a part of me knew that no matter how far we drove, we couldn't escape it. It's been months since we left that house, but the nightmares haven't stopped. Laura doesn't speak to me much anymore. We both know we're haunted by what happened, but neither of us has the words to explain it. The knocking. I still hear it sometimes. In the middle of the night, just as I'm about to fall asleep, there's that familiar tapping. It's faint now, barely a whisper in the distance, but it's there. Always there. And the door. I see it in my dreams, waiting for me to come back. Because I know, deep down, that it isn't over. Whatever was behind that door, whatever was waiting for us, it's still out there. And one day, it'll find me. I don't know if it'll ever let me go. I remember the first time it happened. It wasn't anything dramatic, nothing that would have made me question reality. It was subtle, too subtle to even mention to anyone at the time. I was brushing my teeth, half asleep, eyes drooping as I glanced up at the bathroom mirror. I didn't notice it at first, but my reflection, it lingered. Just for a second, maybe half a second, longer than it should have. I laughed it off, chalking it up to my mind playing tricks on me after another late night. But as I splashed water on my face and dried it off, I glanced back at the mirror again, just to be sure. My reflection stared back, perfectly normal. Still, something felt off. The next few days, I tried to ignore it. Life went on, work, home, the usual routine. But every time I caught my reflection in a mirror, whether it was the bathroom, a shop window, or the rearview mirror in my car, I felt that same sense of unease. It was like the person staring back at me wasn't quite me. One evening, I stood in front of the mirror for longer than usual, searching for something, anything that would explain the odd sensation. And then I saw it. A flicker just at the edges of my reflection's mouth. It was so quick I almost missed it, but I swear the corners of its lips twitched, like it was smirking at me. Now, I know how this sounds. Crazy, right? But it wasn't. I'm not crazy. I could feel something was wrong, like a sixth sense warning me that I wasn't alone in my own reflection. I tried to avoid mirrors after that. I'd shave without looking, brush my teeth with my eyes closed. I stopped checking my reflection when I walked past windows. But the harder I tried to avoid it, the more drawn to it I became. Every reflective surface felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to look. One night, curiosity got the better of me. I sat down in front of the mirror in my bedroom. I stared, waiting for something to happen. Minutes ticked by. My reflection stared back, unblinking, unmoving, just like me. I was about to give up, convinced I had let my paranoia get the best of me, when suddenly, my reflection moved. It smiled at me, and I wasn't smiling. I froze, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. The thing in the mirror grinned wider, its teeth sharper than mine, its eyes darker. It raised a hand slowly, pressing its palm against the glass, like it wanted to come through. I backed away, stumbling over the chair. But my reflection stayed there, frozen in place, grinning that awful, sharp-toothed grin. I shut my eyes, refusing to look, but the feeling that something was wrong gnawed at me. I knew I couldn't avoid it forever. Whatever was happening, it wasn't going away. I had to confront it. The next day, I decided I'd stand in front of the mirror again and demand answers. But when I woke up that morning, something had changed. The face staring back at me from the bathroom mirror wasn't my face anymore. It still looked like me, but there were subtle differences, things only I would notice. My eyes were darker, my skin a shade paler. My hair, usually messy, was perfectly neat. Panic gripped me as I tried to touch my face, but it was like the mirror wouldn't let me. My reflection moved independently now, no longer following my actions, and then it spoke. "I've been waiting for this," it said, its voice a distorted version of mine. I stumbled back, gripping the edge of the sink, unable to tear my eyes away from the thing that had my face. My heart raced, cold sweat dripping down my forehead. I didn't know what to do. How could you fight something that wasn't even real? something that lived in a reflection. "You're not real," I whispered, more to myself than to it. It laughed, a low, raspy sound that made my skin crawl. "Oh, I'm real," it said, grinning wider. "More real than you think. And I'm tired of being stuck on the other side." I felt the room closing in around me, the walls pressing tighter. The reflection raised a hand again, this time pressing its palm harder against the mirror. Cracks started to form around its fingers, spider webbing across the glass. I wanted to run, to get as far away from this cursed mirror as possible, but I couldn't move. My legs were frozen in place. "You've had your time," it hissed. "Now it's my turn." With a final push, the mirror shattered. I threw my arms up to shield myself from the shards, but there was no sound of glass hitting the floor. When I opened my eyes, the mirror was whole again. But it wasn't my reflection standing in front of me anymore. It was me. It was the real me, and I was still trapped behind the glass. I screamed, pounding my fists against the cold surface, but no sound came out. I was in the mirror now, watching helplessly as my reflection, it stepped out into my world, into my life. It smirked, running its hands over my face, as if adjusting to the skin. "I'll make a better you than you ever did," it said with a wink, before turning and walking out of the bathroom. I pounded harder against the glass, desperate, frantic. But I was invisible, stuck in this mirrored prison while it lived my life. Days passed. Weeks. Every so often, I'd catch glimpses of what it was doing. Its reflection in other mirrors, windows, anything that would let me see. It had taken over my job, my apartment, my friends. No one noticed the difference. No one noticed that I was gone. Worse still, it was changing. The way it smiled, the way it looked at people, it wasn't me anymore. Its eyes grew darker, its expressions more twisted. Every time I saw it, the reflection became less like me and more like something else. And then, one night, I saw it kill. I was trapped in the bathroom mirror, staring out at the same scene I had seen 1,000 times. But this time, I saw it return home, blood on its hands, a satisfied grin stretched across its face. It looked at itself in the mirror, meeting my eyes that were no longer human. "I told you," it whispered, leaning closer to the glass. "I'm better at being you than you ever were." I screamed again, but nothing could change the fact that I was stuck here. I could see everything it did, hear every lie it told, watch every terrible thing it did in my name. And there was nothing I could do about it. But it wasn't done with me. Every night, it would return to the mirror, looking at me with those cold, dark eyes and whisper things. "You'll fade away soon," it said one night, as its face twisted into something unrecognizable. "You'll be nothing but a ghost in the glass." I could feel it happening. Slowly but surely, I was disappearing. My thoughts were fading, my memories slipping away. I was becoming a shadow, a mere reflection of something that used to exist. And it thrived. Every day, it grew more powerful, more like the monster it was meant to be. I could only watch as it lived my life, until one day I wouldn't be able to watch anymore. I'm writing this while I still can. Soon, there will be nothing left of me, just the thing that took my place. So, if you ever feel like something's off when you look in the mirror, if you ever notice that your reflection doesn't move quite like it should, run. Run before it's too late. Because once it's out, there's no going back. I barely recognize myself anymore. What's left of me is fading fast, and soon I'll be gone completely. I'm not even sure if anyone will read this, or if I'm just screaming into the void. But if someone finds this, remember, it's waiting, always watching. And if you give it the chance, it will take your place too. I've always loved the feeling of adventure, the pull of the unknown. Maybe that's why I agreed to join the expedition in the first place. I had known the team for years. Ben, our leader, with his unmatched knowledge of ancient civilizations, Claire, a meticulous archaeologist, and Luke, our quiet but resourceful survivalist. I was just the curious one, the tag-along who loved history and exploration as much as the next person, but without any real expertise. But none of us were prepared for what we would discover. It was supposed to be a simple exploration of a newly discovered cave system in a remote mountain range. We had heard rumors from the local villagers, stories passed down through generations of a cave filled with strange markings, but they always warned people to stay away. To them, it was a place of bad omens. Of course, we didn't believe in curses or spirits. We were rational, educated people. We thought we were prepared. The trek to the cave was exhausting. It took days of hiking through dense forests and navigating treacherous cliffs. But when we finally arrived, the cave entrance loomed before us like the mouth of some ancient beast. It was dark, colder than the air outside, and the wind seemed to whistle a strange, haunting tune as it blew past the opening. Still, we pushed forward. After all, this was the kind of discovery that could make history. The cave was deeper than we expected. The air grew colder the further we went, and the sunlight from the entrance soon disappeared behind us, leaving only the beams of our flashlights to guide the way. At first, the walls were smooth, nothing unusual. But as we descended into the main chamber, we saw them, markings. Ancient symbols, unlike anything I had ever seen. They were carved into the stone, spiraling patterns and crude depictions of figures that looked human, but not quite. Their elongated limbs and distorted faces seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. There was something about them that sent a shiver down my spine. Claire was fascinated, though. She ran her fingers over the carvings, murmuring to herself about their potential meaning. Ben snapped photos, already imagining the headlines. "Look at these figures," Claire said, her voice filled with awe. "They're not just warnings. They're stories." The deeper we went, the more intricate the carvings became. And that's when I began to feel it. The weight of the place. It was as if the air was thickening, pressing down on us. And there was a sound, faint at first, like whispering. I shook it off, convincing myself it was just the wind or the echo of our movements in the cavern. But that didn't stop the unease that gnawed at my gut. It started with small things. Luke was the first to notice. "Did you guys hear that?" he asked, shining his light toward a dark corner of the cave. None of us heard anything at first. Then, after a few more steps, Claire screamed. "What is it?" I rushed over, heart pounding. Claire's face was pale. And I thought I saw something, moving in the shadows. We all turned our flashlights to the same area, but there was nothing, just the cold, damp walls of the cave and the shadows cast by our own lights. Ben laughed it off, trying to ease the tension, but his voice was shaky. "It's just your imagination, Claire. Caves do weird things with light. Shadows play tricks on your mind." But deep down, I didn't believe him. I knew Claire wasn't the type to scare easily. And soon, I started seeing it too, small flickers in the corner of my vision, like something darting just out of sight. Every time I turned my flashlight in that direction, there was nothing. The whispering grew louder, but it still felt distant, like it was coming from somewhere deeper in the cave. The more we explored, the more unnerved we became. The markings on the walls seemed to pulse in the dim light, and that feeling of being watched never went away. Even Ben, always so composed, seemed on edge. He wouldn't admit it, but I could see the way his hand gripped his flashlight a little tighter, how his eyes darted to every shadow. We set up camp in one of the larger chambers, deciding to rest before venturing any deeper. But sleep didn't come easily. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling of the cave, the faint sound of whispers echoing around me. It wasn't just the wind anymore. I could make out words, though I couldn't understand the language. They were ancient, guttural sounds that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, Luke sat up, his eyes wide. "Did you hear that?" Footsteps, coming from the entrance. We all jumped to our feet, shining our flashlights toward the entrance of the chamber. But again nothing, only darkness. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Something was in the cave with us, watching, waiting. The next day we pressed on, though no one spoke much. The deeper we went, the worse it got. The air was stifling, and the darkness felt oppressive, as though it was swallowing us whole. I felt it in my bones, a dread I couldn't shake, a sense that we had crossed a line. We weren't supposed to be here. That's when it happened. We lost Luke. One moment, he was walking beside me, his flashlight scanning the walls, and the next, he was gone. "Luke?" I called out, my voice echoing in the darkness. "Luke." But there was no answer. We retraced our steps, searching for him, but it was as if he had vanished into thin air. Ben tried to keep us calm, insisting we'd find him, that he had just wandered off. But I knew better. Luke wouldn't have just left. The whispers grew louder, and now they seemed to be all around us. I could feel something watching us, moving just beyond the light of our flashlights. Claire was shaking, her eyes wide with fear. "We need to get out of here," she whispered. But it was too late. The cave wouldn't let us leave. As we hurried back toward the entrance, we realized the cave had changed. The path we had taken no longer looked the same. It twisted and turned in ways it hadn't before, and the walls seemed to close in around us. Panic set in, and I could feel the terror rising in my chest. That's when I saw it. A shadow, darker than the others, moving toward us. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its limbs were long and twisted, just like the figures in the markings. Its eyes, if you could call them that, were glowing faintly in the darkness, and they were fixed on me. I froze. I couldn't move. The whispers were deafening now, filling my head with words I couldn't understand, but somehow knew were meant for me. The shadow reached out, its hand brushing against my arm, and I felt a cold like I had never felt before. It wasn't just cold, it was emptiness, a void that threatened to swallow me whole. Ben grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the shadow, and we ran. But Claire wasn't so lucky. I heard her scream, a sound that still haunts me, but when I turned around she was gone, just like Luke. It was just me and Ben now, but we both knew it was over. There was no way out. The cave wouldn't let us leave, and whatever was in here with us wasn't going to let us go. We tried though. We ran through the twisting tunnels, but every path led us deeper into the darkness. Ben was the next to fall. One moment he was beside me, and the next he was gone, pulled into the shadows by something I couldn't see. I didn't even hear him scream. And now I'm alone. I'm sitting here in the darkness, the whispers all around me. The shadow is close now, I can feel it. It's watching me, waiting. I know what it wants. It wants me to join the others, to become part of this place, just like the ones who came before us. I should have listened to the villagers. I should have left when I had the chance. But it's too late now. The cake has me. The darkness has me. And soon it will have you too. I never believed in that kind of stuff. You know, the chain letters, the warnings of bad luck, the spooky pass this on or else nonsense. It all seemed too childish for me. After all, we're in the digital age, not some medieval curse-filled world. At least, that's what I told myself when I opened that strange email. It was late. The kind of late where everything is too quiet, even the clock ticking in the living room. I was scrolling through my emails, half asleep when I saw it. The subject line read, "Forward this or face the consequences." I rolled my eyes. Another spam email. I almost deleted it without a second glance, but something about the sender's name caught my attention. It was unsettling. There was no name, just a vague promise of doom. Still, curiosity got the better of me. I clicked it. The email was short, almost too simple. It said, "This is your only warning. Send this to 5 friends within the next 24 hours or face the consequences. Something terrible will happen if you ignore this." I couldn't help but laugh. Terrible things happen every day, right? How could this dumb email possibly make a difference? I closed the laptop, dismissing the idea entirely. That night, though, something strange happened. I couldn't sleep. The air felt heavier than usual, like it was thick with something invisible. There was a soft buzzing sound, almost like a whisper, but I couldn't make out where it was coming from. My phone screen flickered briefly, just enough to catch my eye, before going black again. Weird, but I brushed it off. The next morning, I woke up groggier than usual. I thought about the email again, almost as a joke. Did something bad happen? No, of course not. Life was normal, and I had more important things to deal with than some stupid chain letter. Hours passed by, and everything seemed fine, until it wasn't. As the day went on, little things started to go wrong. At first, they were so small that I barely noticed them. I couldn't find my keys, but that happens, right? Then my phone died, even though I had charged it overnight. A slight inconvenience, I told myself. But by the time I got to work, it felt like the world was out to get me. I tripped on the sidewalk, spilling my coffee all over my clothes. My boss called me into a meeting to tell me I had forgotten an important deadline, something I never do. Even my friends seemed distant. When I tried calling Jess, she didn't answer, and we always talked during our lunch break. As the hours passed, an eerie sense of dread started to creep in. It wasn't the normal kind of stress, either. It felt different, like something was watching me. By the time I got home that evening, I was on edge. The apartment was dark, even though I had left the lights on that morning. As I fumbled for the light switch, my phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, grateful for the distraction, but my heart sank when I saw the notification. No way, I deleted that email. My hands trembled as I opened it again, reading the message. You didn't listen. Now, something terrible will happen. This is your last chance. Forward this to 5 people or face the consequences. A cold chill ran down my spine. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, loud and insistent. I didn't believe in this sort of thing, did I? But now, it felt like the room was closing in on me. The air was thick again, that strange buzzing sound back in the background. I turned off my phone, hoping to shake the feeling, but something was off. My laptop, which I hadn't touched since that morning, suddenly flickered to life. The screen glowed, and I saw the email again, this time in bold letters. Forward this. My stomach dropped. I ran over to the laptop and slammed it shut, but the buzzing in the air grew louder. It wasn't coming from the electronics, it was coming from the walls. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block out the noise, but it felt like it was crawling inside my brain. Then the lights went out. The apartment was pitch black, save for the faint glow from my phone's lock screen. I could barely make out the time, 3:33 a.m. Perfect. The witching hour, as some call it. My breathing was heavy, and I felt like I was suffocating in my own space. I sat on the edge of my bed, my back pressed against the headboard, waiting for something, anything, to happen. My phone buzzed again. Unknown number. You should have forwarded it. I didn't dare respond. My body felt paralyzed, but my mind was racing. Was this just some sick joke? A hacker messing with me? Or was it something worse? Every horror movie I had ever seen suddenly felt like it was my life now. There was a knock at my door. I froze. It wasn't a polite knock. It was slow, deliberate, as if someone, or something, was waiting. I couldn't bring myself to move. The knocking continued, louder this time. My pulse quickened. I swallowed hard, inching closer to the door, trying to convince myself it was just a neighbor or a mistake. But deep down, I knew better. No one knocked like that at this hour. I peered through the peephole, but no one was there. Yet the knocking persisted, louder still. The door shook slightly with each hit, and I backed away, heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, the knocking stopped, replaced by silence. An unbearable silence. I let out a shaky breath, thinking maybe it was over, but as I turned to retreat into the safety of my bedroom, the faintest whisper echoed in my ear. You didn't forward it. I screamed. Spinning around, I found nothing behind me. No one, just the crushing emptiness of my apartment. My phone buzzed again, pulling me out of my panic. Unknown number. It's too late now. The whisper returned, this time louder, clearer. Too late now. The voice was right next to my ear, cold and raspy. It wasn't just my imagination anymore. Something was in the room with me. Without thinking, I bolted for the door. I needed to get out, anywhere but here. I yanked it open, but as soon as I stepped into the hallway, the lights above me flickered. Then I saw it. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the far end of the hallway, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. It didn't move. It just stood there watching me. My breath caught in my throat as I stepped back, slamming my door shut again. I was trapped. The figure's voice, that same whisper, filled the room once more, echoing in my head. You should have listened. The rest of that night was a blur. I don't remember how long I stayed curled up in the corner of my apartment, shaking. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure again. Every time I tried to move, I felt like I was being watched. By the time dawn broke, I was too exhausted to think straight. But one thing was clear. This wasn't over. The next day, I finally decided to forward the email. I sent it to 5 random contacts in my inbox, hoping that would end whatever curse I had brought upon myself. But even after I hit send, the feeling of dread didn't leave me. If anything, it grew stronger. Later that afternoon, one of my friends called. I got your email. Is this some kind of joke? She asked, laughing nervously. I wanted to tell her not to worry, to just delete it. But before I could speak, she paused. Wait, who's that behind you? The call cut off. My heart skipped a beat as I turned around. No one was there. But on my phone screen, the reflection showed that same figure from the hallway, standing right behind me. closer this time. And that's when I realized forwarding the email didn't stop anything. It was never about the email. It was about me. I stared at the reflection on my phone, my hands shaking. The figure behind me was still watching, waiting. I didn't dare turn around again. I couldn't. My legs felt like they were glued to the ground, my heart pounding so loudly it echoed in my ears. Why me? I whispered to no one in particular, hoping for an answer, but knowing none would come. Then my phone buzzed again. Unknown number. It's your turn now. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. What did it want? What was I supposed to do? Panic surged through me, and for the first time, I truly regretted not forwarding that stupid email earlier. But even as that thought crossed my mind, I knew it was too late. The rules were clear. I had ignored the warning. The air around me felt suffocating, like something was closing in. I could feel it watching, waiting for me to make a move. I slowly lowered the phone, trying to summon the courage to face whatever was behind me. My body trembled as I turned around, expecting to see the figure looming over me. But there was nothing. The room was empty. For a moment, I thought I was safe, that maybe it was all in my head. But that hope was shattered when the lights flickered violently. The buzzing sound from before returned, louder this time, like it was coming from everywhere at once. It was unbearable. Then, a shadow moved across the room, fast, too fast for me to track. My breath hitched as the shadow darted past me, circling like a predator stalking its prey. I could feel its presence all around me, cold, unforgiving. Suddenly, my phone buzzed one last time. The screen lit up with a final message. Unknown number, you can't escape it. I dropped the phone, backing into the corner of the room. My head was spinning, fear consuming every rational thought I had left. It wasn't going to stop. I had unleashed something that couldn't be stopped by an email or a message. And now it wanted me. The room grew colder as the shadow crept closer. I could see it now, twisting, writhing, shifting as it approached. It was almost human, but not quite. Its face, or what I assumed was its face, was nothing but darkness, a void of emptiness staring back at me. I could feel its eyes on me, even though it had none. I screamed. I screamed for help, for anyone to hear me, but no one did. The walls seemed to close in, the air thickening until it was almost impossible to breathe. The buzzing sound was deafening now, drowning out everything else. The shadow reached out, its cold, formless hand brushing against my arm. I flinched, expecting pain, but what I felt was far worse. It wasn't physical pain, it was something deeper. A coldness that seeped into my very soul, paralyzing me with fear. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. The shadow leaned in closer, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. I could hear its voice now, whispering in my ear. You didn't forward it. And then, nothing. When I woke up, I wasn't in my apartment anymore. I was standing in the middle of a road, surrounded by thick fog. Everything felt muted, distant, like I was trapped in a dream or a nightmare. There were no sounds, no signs of life. Just me, and the endless fog stretching out in every direction. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, like I was walking through water. My mind was foggy too. I could barely remember what had happened, how I got here. But one thing was clear. I was alone. I wandered for what felt like hours, days maybe. There was no sense of time here. The fog never lifted. The road never ended, and I never saw another soul. Occasionally, I would hear the faint sound of my phone buzzing in my pocket, but every time I reached for it, there was nothing there, just the endless empty fog. It wasn't until much later that I realized what had happened. I was trapped. The shadow hadn't killed me. It had taken me, somewhere between life and death, somewhere I could never escape. The chain ladder hadn't been a joke, it had been a warning, and I hadn't listened. Now I was part of it. Days turned into weeks, or maybe months. Time had no meaning here. I was just existing. No one knew where I had gone. No one would ever know. I was just another name, another person who didn't forward the letter. And every once in a while, I would see it again, the shadow, watching, waiting, like it was waiting for the next person to ignore the warning. I'm writing this now as a final message, a warning to anyone who finds this. If you ever receive that email, or a letter, or anything like it, forward it. Don't question it. Don't doubt it. Just send it. Because if you don't, well, let's just say you'll wish you had. I still remember the day I found that cursed map. It was tucked inside an old book in my grandpa's attic, buried under layers of dust and forgotten memories. It seemed like a simple treasure map at first, faded parchment, scribbled landmarks, and an X marking the spot where, I thought, riches awaited. I didn't think twice about it. My heart raced with excitement, imagining piles of gold or sparkling jewels waiting just for me. My grandpa had always been one for stories, and it felt like one of those grand adventures he used to tell me before bed. How could I resist? The map led me to a secluded forest on the outskirts of town, a place I had never ventured into before. I borrowed an old shovel from my garage, threw on a backpack, and set out, completely unaware of the horrors I was about to uncover. It was a quiet morning, too quiet. The birds weren't singing, and even the wind seemed hesitant to stir the trees. I followed the map closely, my heart pounding as the path twisted through dense woods and unfamiliar terrain. Every now and then, I checked the map, hoping I hadn't missed a turn or strayed too far. But there was no mistaking it. The X was close. After what felt like hours of walking, I finally reached the spot. The ground was soft, almost like it had been disturbed recently, though that should have been impossible. I took a deep breath, raised the shovel, and started digging. The first few scoops of dirt were easy. I thought about the treasure, how my life would change once I unearthed it. But as I dug deeper, my shovel hit something hard, something solid. My heart leaped with excitement. This had to be it. The treasure. But as I cleared away more dirt, my excitement turned to horror. It wasn't treasure. It was a body. The skeletal remains lay twisted and broken, as if they had been thrown into the ground haphazardly. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. Who would bury a body here, and why? But more importantly, what had I just gotten myself into? I should have stopped. I should have turned around and left the woods right then and there. But some unseen force wouldn't let me. It was like the map itself was pulling me deeper into this nightmare. I kept digging. Body after body. Each one more decayed, more horrifying than the last. Some looked ancient, their bones brittle and crumbling. Others seemed more recent, as if they had been buried only days before I found them. There was no pattern, no logic to it, just death. By the time I had unearthed the third body, my hands were trembling. The air seemed heavier, like the trees themselves were watching me. A chill ran down my spine, and I glanced around, half expecting someone, or something, to be lurking in the shadows. But there was no one, just the dead. I told myself to stop. Every rational thought screamed at me to leave that cursed place, but my body didn't listen. Instead, I unfolded the map again. The ink had started to blur, and I swore I saw new markings appear on the paper. It made no sense, but then again, nothing about this made sense anymore. The X had moved. It was now further into the woods, deeper into the darkness where the trees were denser, and the light barely filtered through. I could have walked away, left the nightmare behind, but something, maybe it was my own curiosity or maybe something darker, pushed me forward. I slung the shovel over my shoulder and pressed on, the oppressive silence growing thicker with every step. As I reached the new X on the map, the forest itself seemed to shift. The ground beneath my feet felt softer, almost like walking on a sponge. The trees whispered around me, though there was no wind. My heart pounded louder with every step, my mind racing with images of what I might find beneath the soil. I started digging again. This time, the ground gave way much faster, like it was eager to reveal its secrets. Within minutes, I hit something solid. I paused, catching my breath, hoping beyond hope that it wasn't another body. But when I brushed away the dirt, I saw it. Bones, pale, twisted, and barely buried beneath the surface. But this one was different. There was something clutched in the bony hand of the skeleton, something that shimmered even in the dim light. A key. I pried it loose, feeling a strange surge of warmth as it left the skeleton's grip. My mind swirled with questions. What did it unlock? And why had it been buried here? But there was no time to think. The ground beneath me rumbled. The dirt shifted, collapsing into the hole I had dug. The bodies I'd uncovered seemed to move, their skeletal hands reaching for the surface. I scrambled back, dropping the shovel and clutching the key in my hand like it was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. I stumbled, falling onto my back, and looked up at the tree line. The shadows had shifted again, darker and denser. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. A figure standing just at the edge of the clearing. I couldn't make out any features, but I knew it was watching me. I could feel its eyes on me. I tried to shout, tried to move, but my body wouldn't cooperate. The figure stepped closer, slowly, deliberately. I could see it more clearly now, tattered clothes, skin stretched tightly over a skeletal frame. But its eyes, they were hollow, black pits that seemed to draw the light in and swallow it whole. It raised a bony finger, pointing directly at me. I don't know how long I lay there, frozen in fear, but eventually the figure retreated into the woods. The rumbling stopped, and the bodies below the surface went still. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears, my breath ragged and shallow. I didn't know what to do. The key felt heavier in my hand, like it was pulling me in a direction I didn't want to go. But again, that strange compulsion took over. I had to find out what it unlocked. I got to my feet, shaking off the dirt and debris, and followed the path deeper into the woods. It felt like hours, maybe even days, but time didn't seem to matter anymore. The further I went, the darker the world became. The trees were twisted, gnarled things, their branches reaching out like claws. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and every now and then I heard whispers, voices that seemed to come from the very ground beneath me. At last I reached it. A small, ancient stone building, half buried by time and overgrowth. It was more like a crypt than anything else, with a large iron door at the front. My hand trembled as I brought the key up to the lock. It fit perfectly. The door swung open with a low groan, revealing a staircase leading down into the earth. I hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The air was cool and damp, filled with the scent of old stone and something else, something rotten. My footsteps echoed as I descended, the light from the surface fading behind me. At the bottom of the stairs, I found a room. It was small and unremarkable, save for the large stone sarcophagus at its center. Carved into the lid were strange symbols I couldn't read, but they pulsed with a faint, eerie light. I approached it, the key still in my hand. The lid wasn't sealed. I could move it. And I did. Inside was not what I expected. It wasn't a body. It was me. I stood there, staring down at my own lifeless form, dressed exactly as I was, the same terrified expression on my face. I stumbled back, my mind unable to comprehend what I was seeing. How could this be possible? Before I could react, the lid of the sarcophagus slammed shut, and the room began to shake. The walls trembled, dust falling from the ceiling as the ground beneath my feet shifted. I tried to run, but the staircase had disappeared, replaced by solid stone. I was trapped. I pounded on the walls, screaming, begging for help, but no one came. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I felt the presence of something ancient and malevolent, closing in around me. I fell to the floor, clutching the key tightly in my hand. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me whole was the lid of the sarcophagus slowly opening again. And inside, I saw myself waiting. The cold crept in, the kind of cold that wasn't just in the air, but in your bones. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The walls around me felt closer, tighter. There was a pull, like gravity, but deeper, dragging me toward that stone coffin. I knew I shouldn't look, but I did, and what I saw made my heart stop. The me inside the sarcophagus was sitting up now, eyes wide open, staring back at me. It smiled. A slow, sinister grin stretched across its face. The expression was mine, but twisted, warped, like a reflection in a broken mirror. It stood up, movements stiff and unnatural, and climbed out of the coffin. I was frozen in place, every muscle locked in terror. This thing, this version of me, took a step forward. I backed up, stumbling, my back hitting the stone wall behind me. I tried to scream, but my throat was tight, like something was squeezing it shut. The other me stopped a few feet away, tilting its head as if it were studying me, deciding what to do next. "I've been waiting," it said, its voice an eerie echo of my own. I didn't understand. Waiting? For what? My thoughts raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. The crypt, the walls, Everything was closing in, sealing me in this nightmare. The thing grinned wider, its eyes darkening, becoming black pits of nothingness. "You're too late," it whispered, stepping even closer. "It's already done." I felt it then, a shift, something snapping inside me. I looked down at my hands, at the key still clutched between my fingers. It was no longer cold, but burning hot, searing into my palm. I dropped it, watching as it clattered to the floor, glowing faintly before disappearing into the stone. The air around me thickened, the walls groaned, and suddenly, everything began to spin. My vision blurred, the room warping and twisting until I could barely tell where I was. The only thing that remained clear was the other me, standing just inches away now, staring with those empty, hollow eyes. I wanted to scream, to run, but I couldn't move. My feet were rooted to the spot. My body, my mind, everything was being pulled apart, like threads unraveling from a piece of cloth. I felt myself slipping away, the world dimming, fading, until all that was left was darkness. But in that darkness, I saw something, a faint flicker of light. It grew brighter, closer, and as it did, I realized it wasn't a light at all. It was the map. The same cursed map that had led me here, now glowing in the void. It floated in front of me, mocking me, its lines and symbols shifting, changing. The X moved again, this time right where I stood. I reached for it, desperate, thinking that maybe, somehow, it could save me. But as my fingers touched the parchment, the map crumbled to dust. And then I was gone. I don't know how long I was trapped in that void, or if I ever really left. The next thing I remember is waking up in the forest, the shovel still in my hand. The sun was setting, casting long shadows through the trees. I looked around, disoriented, confused. The crypt, the bodies, the other May, they were all gone. Had it been a dream? I stood up, brushing the dirt off my clothes, trying to make sense of it all. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. There, on the ground where I had been digging, was the key. The same key I had dropped in the crypt. My heart pounded in my chest. It wasn't a dream. It had all been real. I picked up the key, my hand trembling, and stuffed it into my pocket. I needed to get out of there. I needed to forget. But as I started walking, I noticed something else. Footprints. Dozens of them, all leading away from the spot where I had dug. I followed them, heart racing, until they led me to the edge of the woods. There, standing in the fading light, was a figure. Tall, thin, with tattered clothes and hollow eyes. It was me. The other me. I froze, the world spinning around me as I watched it disappear into the trees, the same twisted grin on its face. And that's when I realized I was no longer the one holding the map. The map had me. To this day, I don't know what happened in those woods. I don't know what the key unlocked, or why the bodies were there, or what that thing was that looked like me. But one thing is for sure, I was never the same after that day. The map, it's still out there somewhere. And every now and then I see it. In my dreams, in the shadows, always waiting, always watching. But I know better now. I know the real treasure wasn't gold or jewels. The real treasure was death. I woke up to the faint buzzing of my phone. My room was pitch black except for the dull glow of the clock on my nightstand, 2:17 a.m. Confused, I reached for my phone, thinking maybe it was a late-night message from a friend. Instead, it was an unknown number. Now normally, I wouldn't answer calls like that, especially not in the middle of the night. But something about it felt off. My finger hovered over the screen for a moment before I pressed accept and held the phone to my ear. "Hello." My voice came out groggy and weak. For a second, there was nothing but dead silence. And then, I heard something that made my heart skip a beat. "Run." The voice was shaky, scared, but familiar. It sounded just like mine. "What?" I sat up, suddenly wide awake. "Run," the voice repeated, a little more urgent this time. "Get out now, before it's too late." I swallowed hard, the air in my room growing thick and cold. "Who is this?" The line crackled with static, but I could make out the voice's response through the interference. You need to leave, or you won't make it." A chill crawled up my spine as I realized that the voice on the other end sounded exactly like me. Every inflection, every pause the same. It was me talking, warning myself. "This isn't funny," I said, trying to sound brave, though my heart was pounding like a drum in my chest. What's going on? But the line went dead. I sat there in stunned silence for a moment, clutching the phone as if waiting for it to ring again. Nothing. My room felt suddenly oppressive, the darkness closing in around me. Something didn't feel right. My pulse raced, and I glanced around, feeling a growing sense of dread. It didn't make sense. How could that voice be mine? And why was it telling me to run? Just as I was about to dismiss it as a prank, something happened. There was a soft knock at my window. I froze. Now, I lived on the second floor of my house, and there was no way someone could be standing outside my window unless they had a ladder. Slowly, with trembling hands, I reached over and pulled back the curtain. Nothing. The street outside was deserted, bathed in the eerie glow of a single streetlight. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was out there watching. My breath caught in my throat. This was insane. There was no way that voice could have been mine, and yet it was. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to run like I'd been told. Suddenly, my phone buzzed again. The same unknown number flashed across the screen. I hesitated for a moment, then answered. "You need to go." Now, the voice demanded, sounding more desperate than before. "It's already here." I jumped out of bed, my heart racing as I grabbed my jacket and slipped on my shoes. I didn't know what was going on, but I wasn't about to stick around and find out. The voice, it was too real, too urgent to ignore. Throwing open my bedroom door, I bolted down the stairs, every creak of the floorboards making me flinch. The house was eerily silent, too silent. I could hear my own breath, quick and shallow, as I reached the front door. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, coming from behind me. My skin went cold. I didn't want to look back, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I turned around. Nothing. The hallway was empty. I stood there, frozen in place, staring into the dark, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then, from the shadows, I heard it again, the same voice from the phone. "Run." Without another thought, I yanked the front door open and sprinted into the night. The cold air hit my face, sharp and biting, but I didn't care. I just kept running, my feet pounding the pavement, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away. As I ran, the streets around me seemed to blur, the world warping in ways I couldn't understand. The houses I passed looked twisted, wrong, as if they weren't supposed to be there. Streetlights flickered, casting strange shadows that seemed to reach out toward me. My phone buzzed again in my pocket, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. "Keep running," my voice urged me through the static. "Don't look back." I was gasping for breath, my legs burning, but I couldn't slow down. There was something behind me, something I couldn't see but could feel, creeping closer with every step. And then, without warning, everything went quiet. I skidded to a stop, my chest heaving as I looked around. The streets were empty. The world was still. Even the wind had died, leaving the air heavy and stagnant. My phone buzzed again, and this time, I couldn't resist the urge to look. When I pulled it out, the screen was black. No number, no message, just a single word. "Run." I backed away, my hands shaking as I realized the truth. I wasn't running from something outside. I was running from something inside. I had been too late. My phone slipped from my hand, clattering to the ground as I felt a cold presence wrap around me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My body froze in place, every muscle locked in terror as the shadow closed in. I had been warned. I had heard my own voice. And now it was over. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed, as the darkness crept closer. The air around me grew thick, suffocating, like I was being slowly buried alive. My legs refused to move. My body betrayed me, frozen in place, as though it had given up long before my mind did. The cold presence enveloped me, and with it, I felt something unfamiliar. A weight in my chest, pressing down harder with each passing second. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't even think. Suddenly, my phone lit up again, lying there on the ground where I had dropped it. The screen flickered once, twice, and then a single message appeared. "It's you now." I stared down at the phone, my mind racing, trying to comprehend what that could possibly mean. But then it hit me. This thing, this darkness, it wasn't chasing me to harm me. It was chasing me to become me. The voice on the other end of that phone call wasn't some twisted prank. It wasn't just a future version of me warning myself. It was something darker, something far worse. I tried to move, tried to will my legs to turn around, to flee. But no matter how hard I pushed, my body didn't respond. I was trapped. The footsteps returned, slow and deliberate, echoing louder in the suffocating silence. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Instead, I heard it, the same voice, my voice, speaking to me again, but this time, it wasn't on the phone. It was right behind me. You waited too long. The voice wasn't human anymore. It was distorted, warped, like nails on a chalkboard. I could feel it creeping up on me, could almost sense its breath on the back of my neck. I closed my eyes, bracing for whatever was coming. My body trembled, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. But instead of pain, instead of a final violent end, I felt nothing. When I opened my eyes again, I wasn't standing in the street anymore. I was in my bedroom, staring at myself. My own body frozen in time, as if nothing had happened. I tried to call out, tried to reach out to the figure lying on the bed, but it was useless. Because I wasn't me anymore. I was the presence. The thing that had been chasing me, the thing that had warned me to run, it had caught me. I wasn't the same anymore. I was the shadow now, the cold presence that lurked in the dark. And the worst part, I could see myself, my real self, still lying there, unaware of what was coming next. Suddenly, the phone on the nightstand buzzed, breaking the silence. My old body stirred, groggy and confused, as the screen lit up. 2:17 a.m. It was starting over. I watched in helpless horror as my old self picked up the phone, hesitating before answering. Hello. My voice, weak and groggy, came through the phone. And just like before, I heard my own voice, distorted and terrified, speak back. Run. The cycle had begun again. I am still here, watching myself, doomed to relive the same nightmare over and over. The more I try to break free, the stronger the pull becomes. I don't know how long it's been, days, weeks, maybe even months, but one thing is clear. There's no escape. I am the warning now, and I know that someday, someone will answer that call, just like I did. And when they do, they will become what I am, trapped in the loop, forever running, forever caught. But it will be too late, just like it was for me. I remember the first time we laid eyes on that house. It was perfect, or so we thought. It was tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, with just enough distance from the city to feel peaceful, but close enough to keep things convenient. The price was almost too good to be true, but we didn't think twice. The realtor smiled a bit too much when we signed the papers, but I figured she was just thrilled about closing the deal. The first couple of weeks were everything we hoped for. We painted the walls, rearranged furniture, and made the house our own. It wasn't until that morning, when we found the letter, that things started to shift. It was a normal day. My wife, Emma, and I were having breakfast when the mail arrived. Among the usual bills and junk mail was a worn, yellowing envelope with no return address. The handwriting was shaky, as if it had been scrawled by someone in a hurry. Inside, a single piece of paper held a short message. Do not open the basement door. Trust us. I stared at the note, trying to make sense of it. Emma was the first to laugh. Is this some sort of joke? She said, flipping the paper over to see if there was anything else. We don't even have a basement. She was right. We'd been through every inch of the house, or so we thought. But something about the note nagged at me. It was unsettling, even though it didn't make sense. Who would leave such a message? Later that day, I couldn't shake the feeling, so I went exploring. The house was old, with little quirks and oddities in its structure, and that's when I found it. Behind a large antique cabinet in the living room, there was a door we hadn't noticed before. It was small, almost hidden, with an old brass knob that looked untouched for years. My stomach twisted as I realized this must be what the note was talking about. Emma, I called, my voice shaky. You need to see this. When she joined me, her face mirrored my unease. She touched the knob but didn't turn it. I don't like this, she said. That note, what if it's true? I wasn't sure what I believed. Part of me wanted to brush it off as some weird prank by the previous owners. But another part, a deeper, more primal part, felt something lurking behind that door. We both stood there for what felt like an eternity, neither of us daring to open it. Eventually, we decided to ignore it for now. Days passed, and we tried to forget about the basement door. But there was a tension in the house that wasn't there before. At night, I found myself waking up, feeling as though something was pulling me toward that door. Emma noticed it too. We stopped talking about it, but the unspoken fear lingered between us. One evening, about 2 weeks after we found the letter, we'd heard a noise. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from behind the door. Emma and I froze. She looked at me, eyes wide with fear. Neither of us spoke. The sound grew louder, almost insistent, as if someone or something was knocking, waiting to be let out. "I'm sure it's just the house settling," I said, though my voice betrayed the panic rising inside me. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The knocking had a strange pattern, as if it was deliberate. "We should call someone," Emma whispered. "Maybe the realtor, or a priest. This place doesn't feel right." But I didn't want to call anyone. I didn't want to admit that we might have made a mistake moving here. Instead, I convinced Emma and myself that we were overreacting. "We'll just leave it alone," I told her. "Whatever it is, we don't need to mess with it." That night, neither of us slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I heard the sound again. This time, it wasn't knocking. It was whispering. Low, barely audible, like it was coming from far away, but too close at the same time. I couldn't make out the words, but it felt like it was calling to me. Emma stirred beside me. "Do you hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. I nodded. "Stay here. I'll check it out." I grabbed the flashlight and headed downstairs. My heart pounded with every step. The house felt colder than usual, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. When I reached the living room, the air was thick, heavy with something I couldn't name. The whispering stopped as I approached the basement door. My hand shook as I gripped the flashlight, aiming it at the doorframe. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, fighting the urge to reach for the knob. Then I heard it, Emma's voice, faint, barely a whisper. "Come downstairs." I froze. Emma was upstairs, wasn't she? I rushed back up the stairs, 2 at a time. Emma was sitting on the bed, wide awake, her eyes filled with fear. "Did you call me?" I asked. She shook her head. I felt a cold dread wash over me. Something had imitated her voice. It had called me to the door. The next day, we decided to leave. We packed a few essentials, determined to stay at a hotel until we could figure out what to do. But just as we were about to walk out the door, something strange happened. The letter, the one warning us about the basement door, was back on the kitchen table. We had thrown it away, I was sure of it. Yet there it was, as if someone had placed it there on purpose. Emma picked it up, her hands shaking. This time there was more. Under the original warning, in the same shaky handwriting, were 2 new words. "It's awake." We stood frozen in place, staring at the letter. I could feel my heartbeat thudding in my ears. Emma dropped the note like it was burning her. "What does that mean?" she whispered. I didn't have an answer, but I knew one thing. Whatever was behind that door wasn't something we could ignore any longer. The decision had been made for us. That night, despite every instinct telling me not to, I walked toward the door with a crowbar in hand. Emma begged me not to go near it, but I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to know. We couldn't live in fear forever. As I pried the door open, the air around me grew colder, and a foul stench hit me, like rotting meat, old and sickening. I shined the flashlight into the darkness, but it barely cut through the black void beyond. The basement was deeper than I had expected, the steps leading down into an endless pit. But that wasn't what terrified me the most. It was the feeling. The overwhelming sense that something had been waiting. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The first step creaked under my weight, and I paused, gripping the flashlight tighter. The air grew colder with each step, and I could hear my breath in the eerie silence. Emma stood at the top of the stairs, her eyes wide with fear. I knew she wanted to stop me, but something inside me, something I couldn't explain, was pulling me deeper into the basement. As I descended, the darkness seemed to close in around me, swallowing the light of the flashlight. The smell intensified, thick and nauseating. It felt like the air itself was alive, pressing against me, suffocating. But the worst part was the whispering. It had started again, low and distant, echoing through the basement like a chorus of voices. They were all speaking at once, too soft to understand, but I could feel the malice in their tone. At the bottom of the stairs, the light from my flashlight caught something, an old wooden chest covered in dust and cobwebs. It looked ancient, the kind of thing that didn't belong in any normal house. My heart pounded as I approached it, my hands shaking. The whispering grew louder. I knelt down in front of the chest and hesitated. There was a lock, rusted with age, but it looked like it had been forced open long ago. I placed my hand on the lid, and the whispering stopped. The silence was more terrifying than the voices. I opened the chest. Inside, there were only bones, human bones. They were old, brittle, and broken, but unmistakable. My stomach turned, and I staggered back. But that wasn't what made me scream. It was the eyes. Two pale, glowing eyes staring at me from the corner of the room. Something was crouched there, watching me. It was impossible to describe. Its form shifted, as if it was made of shadow and smoke. But the eyes were real, and they were locked on me. I turned to run, but the basement door slammed shut at the top of the stairs. I pounded on it, screaming for Emma, but she didn't answer. Panic flooded my mind as I heard the thing behind me. Its footsteps were soft but deliberate, growing closer with each second. I turned, and the flashlight flickered out. I was plunged into darkness. I don't know how long I was in that basement. It felt like hours, maybe days. The thing toyed with me, always just out of sight, whispering in my ear, touching the back of my neck. I couldn't escape it. My voice was hoarse from screaming, but no one came. Eventually, the door opened. Emma stood there, her face pale, eyes wide with terror. "What happened?" she whispered. "You've been gone for days." I stumbled out of the basement, trembling, covered in dirt and sweat. I couldn't speak. All I could do was grab her and pull her out of the house. We left that night. We didn't take anything with us. We just ran. We didn't stop until we were miles away, and even then, I could still feel it, the thing from the basement, watching us, following us. But the story doesn't end there. A week later, we received another letter. It was the same shaky handwriting, the same old yellowed paper. But this time, it wasn't a warning. It was an apology. "We're sorry. It's with you now. It won't let go." I dropped the letter, my hands shaking. Emma and I locked eyes, and we both knew there was no escape. Whatever had been in that basement had followed us. It was part of us now. That night, the knocking started again. Only this time, it wasn't coming from a door. It was coming from inside our heads. The whispering followed. It grew louder every night, more insistent, more angry. And then, one night, Emma wasn't there when I woke up. Her side of the bed was cold. I found her in the basement, our new basement. She had opened the door. I tried to pull her out, but she was gone. I could still see her, still hear her voice, but she was different. The thing had taken her. Now I'm alone. The whispers never stop. The knocking is louder. I've tried to move, trying to outrun it, but it's always there. No matter where I go, no matter how far I run, the basement door follows me. And I know one day I'll open it again. And this time it'll take me too. It started with a simple, familiar ring on my phone. A normal evening in my quiet apartment, a beer in hand, and the sound of my favorite show playing in the background. I remember glancing at the screen, expecting it to be another spam call, but the name on it stopped me cold. Mike. Mike was my best friend for most of my life. We'd gone through thick and thin, shared every secret, fought off bullies, even stood by each other at the darkest times. But Mike had been dead for 5 years. His death wasn't a mystery. I was there, standing beside his grave, his family shattered. So, why was his name lighting up my phone? With a trembling hand, I answered. The voice on the other end was unmistakably his. "Tom, I need you. Help me." I froze. I couldn't comprehend it. Mike was dead, but his voice sounded so real, so desperate. "Mike." I stammered. "How? What's going on?" Silence. Then a faint whisper, "Help me. They won't let me go." The line went dead. I was left staring at the phone, my heart pounding in my chest. Was this some kind of sick prank? Someone trying to mess with me using his old number? But how? His phone had been disconnected long ago. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread creeping up my spine. Something wasn't right. I felt compelled to find out what was happening, even though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. The next few days were a blur. I tried calling the number back, but it wouldn't connect. It was as if the call had never happened. But I couldn't get Mike's voice out of my head. His plea for help echoed in my mind, haunting me. I decided to visit his grave. Maybe it was closure I needed, or just some reassurance that I wasn't losing my mind. Standing in front of his headstone, the memory of his funeral came rushing back. But this time, something felt off. The air was thick with tension, almost as if the ground beneath my feet was restless. I knelt down and whispered, "Mike, what's happening?" The wind picked up, and for a brief second, I thought I heard his voice again, faint but unmistakable. "Help me." After that day, strange things started happening. I would hear faint knocks on my door in the middle of the night, but no one would be there. Objects in my apartment would move on their own, nothing dramatic, just subtle shifts, but enough to notice. Once, I woke up to find Mike's old photo on my bedside table, a photo I hadn't looked at in years. But it wasn't just the oddities in my apartment. Every night, I dreamed of Mike, trapped somewhere dark, surrounded by shadowy figures. He'd look at me, eyes wide with terror, whispering the same words, "Help me." And every night, I'd wake up in a cold sweat. I had to do something. My search led me to an old friend of Mike's, someone he had worked with before he died. Greg was reluctant to talk about Mike, but after a few drinks, he opened up. There was something strange about Mike's death, Greg said, his eyes darting nervously. He started talking about something following him. I thought he was just paranoid, maybe stressed, but after he died, I started seeing things too. What things? I pressed. Greg leaned in closer. Shadows, voices, as if Mike's not at peace, as if something is keeping him here. The more I dug into Mike's last days, the more I realized he had been hiding something. His sudden paranoia before his death wasn't a coincidence. He had been involved in something dark, something dangerous. I found an old journal Mike had kept hidden. In it, he wrote about a mysterious place he had visited shortly before his death, an abandoned building on the outskirts of town, a place where he claimed the dead could speak. His last entry was chilling. "I think they found me. If something happens, tell Tom to help me. He'll know what to do." I had to go there. The abandoned building Mike wrote about had been boarded up for years, but breaking in wasn't difficult. As soon as I stepped inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if the air itself was pressing down on me. The walls were covered in strange symbols, and the temperature dropped the further I walked in. In the center of the room, there was an old, cracked mirror. As I approached it, I heard his voice again. "Tom, you're here." I looked into the mirror, and there he was, Mike, standing behind me, his face pale, eyes filled with fear. "I can't leave, Tom." "They won't let me." I tried to speak, but no words came out. Mike's reflection started to distort, the shadows around him twisting and growing. I turned around, but no one was there. Just me and the suffocating darkness of the room. Suddenly, I felt a cold hand on my shoulder. "Tom." His voice was right next to my ear now, desperate, pleading. "Please help me." I knew I had to do something, but what? Mike was trapped between worlds, held by forces I couldn't understand. And the longer I stayed, the more I felt like I was being watched, as if those same forces were closing in on me too. I couldn't leave him there, but every instinct told me to run. As I looked into the mirror again, Mike's face started to change. It wasn't just fear in his eyes now, there was something else, a warning. "You have to leave, Tom. It's too late for me." But I couldn't abandon him. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the mirror. The glass was freezing to the touch, and as soon as my fingers made contact, I felt a pull, like something was dragging me in. The next thing I knew, I was no longer in the building. I was in a place I couldn't describe, cold, dark, and suffocating. I could see Mike in the distance, but every step I took towards him, he seemed to get further away. "Tom, you shouldn't have come here," Mike's voice echoed in the void. "Now you're trapped too." I looked around, panic rising in my chest. Shadows moved all around me, whispering, taunting. I tried to run, but there was nowhere to go. I was lost, just like Mike. I don't know how long I've been here. Time doesn't seem to exist in this place. Every now and then, I hear Mike's voice, but I can never reach him. The shadows are getting closer, and I can feel their cold touch, their whispers growing louder. I tried calling for help, but no one can hear me. No one ever will. I made a mistake coming here. I thought I could save Mike, but now I realize there's no escape. If anyone ever finds this, don't come looking for me. Don't answer the call. Mike was right. They won't let us go. The last thing I remember before the darkness consumed me completely was the sound of my phone ringing one final time. It was Mike. As I lay there in the suffocating darkness, the sound of the phone ringing pierced through the void again. I tried to move, to get up, but my body felt heavy, like something was holding me down. The ringing grew louder and louder, almost unbearable, yet there was something in it that I couldn't resist. It was like a tether pulling me, forcing me to acknowledge it. The shadows began swirling around me, whispering my name, mocking my decision. I knew I shouldn't answer, but I also knew I couldn't ignore it. My hand, trembling and numb, reached for the phone. Tom. Mike's voice came through again, more distorted than before, as if coming from a great distance. You should have never followed me here. I wanted to scream, to ask him how to get out of this nightmare, but no words came. Only silence. Mike spoke again, but this time his voice wasn't pleading. It was colder, darker, almost unrecognizable. They're coming for you now. The line cut out, and the phone slipped from my grasp. The shadows closed in, wrapping around me like a thick fog. I tried to fight them off, but it was useless. I felt my strength fading, my consciousness slipping into a haze. Suddenly, I heard another sound, faint, almost like a distant whisper in the dark. It wasn't coming from the shadows, nor from the phone. It was outside, a soft, muffled knock on a door. I wasn't sure how, but I knew it was my apartment door. I tried to focus to clear my mind, but the shadows wouldn't let me go. The knock grew louder, more insistent. Then a voice, familiar but not Mike's, called out. Tom, open the door. My heart stopped. I knew that voice. It was me. Everything froze. The shadows stopped moving, the air stilled, and the only sound left was the pounding of my heart. The voice outside kept calling, urging me to open the door. But how could I? How could I answer, myself? I was torn between fear and a strange, growing curiosity. Maybe if I opened the door, I'd find a way out. Maybe this was all a twisted dream, and that version of me could guide me back to reality. Or maybe this was just another trick, another layer of this nightmare I was trapped in. The knock came again, more insistent now. Tom, please. And looked down at the phone. The screen flickered briefly, showing a single message. They're watching. I felt the shadows tighten around me once more, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I couldn't think clearly. All I knew was that I had a choice, stay here, trapped forever, or open the door and face whatever was waiting on the other side. My hand shook as I reached for the handle. The door creaked as I pulled it open, the sound echoing through the dark, empty space. I squinted into the dim light beyond, my heart pounding in my chest. But what I saw on the other side was worse than anything I could have imagined. There, standing just outside the door, was me. The same clothes, the same face, the same haunted look in my eyes. But this other version of me looked different. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were hollow, as if something had drained the life from him. I told you not to follow, he or I said, voice flat and emotionless. Now we're both stuck. I staggered back, the weight of the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. The shadows crept closer, as if feeding off my confusion, my terror. The other me stepped forward, his eyes locking onto mine. It's too late. You can't escape now. Before I could respond, the door slammed shut behind him, trapping us both inside the darkness. And then everything went silent. The phone rang once more. We never thought it would go that far. It was supposed to be a joke, a stupid prank. Just a little scare for Derek, who was always so serious, so stiff. He didn't scare easily, so we figured, why not take him into the woods at night, freak him out a bit, and then all have a laugh about it. But the moment Derek disappeared, we knew we were in trouble. It started like any other weekend night for our group, me, Jake, Liv, and Emma. We'd meet up at the old diner on Main Street, scarf down greasy fries. and talk about what we were going to do next. That night, Jake suggested we go out to the forest that bordered our small town. It was a place we'd all gone before, but mostly during the day. There was something about those trees at night, though. They looked different, taller, darker, and more alive. But that was just our imagination, or so we told ourselves. "We'll get him good," Jake smirked, his blue eyes gleaming with mischief. "We'll make him think there's something out there, and when he freaks out, we'll jump out and get him." I should have said no. I should have told them this was a bad idea. But I didn't. I wanted to see Derek lose his cool for once, so I went along with it. We convinced Derek to join us, saying we were just going out for a late-night walk. He was hesitant at first, but eventually gave in. We set off towards the woods, laughing and joking like it was any other night. But as we got deeper into the forest, the mood shifted. It was quieter than usual. No wind, no animals rustling in the underbrush, just an eerie stillness. I glanced over at Derek. He wasn't laughing anymore. He was scanning the trees, his jaw clenched tight. That's when Jake gave me the signal. "Go," he whispered. Liv, Emma, and I slipped away from the group, disappearing into the thick trees. We circled around to get behind Derek, planning to jump out and scare him when Jake gave the cue. But as we crouched there, waiting, something didn't feel right. The air was heavy, almost suffocating. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Suddenly, we heard Derek's voice. "Jake, guys?" He sounded confused, maybe a little scared, but not panicked yet. Jake was supposed to respond. He was supposed to make some creepy noises to freak Derek out, but nothing. Silence. Then came a loud snap, like a tree branch breaking underfoot. Derek's voice rose. "Jake, this isn't funny." Panic crept in now. I looked at Liv and Emma. Something was wrong. We should have come out, ended the prank, but before I could move, I heard footsteps. Not Derek's, not Jake's, something else. The footsteps were heavy, deliberate. They moved quickly, coming closer and closer to where we were hiding. Then, a scream. Derek's scream. It was unlike anything I'd ever heard. A raw, primal sound that echoed through the trees and sent a chill down my spine. Liv gasped and Emma grabbed my arm. We all stood up, abandoning the prank and running back to where we'd left Derek and Jake. But when we got there, only Jake was standing in the small clearing, his face pale, his hands trembling. Derek was gone. What happened?" I asked, my voice shaky. "I don't know," Jake whispered. He was here." And then, something took him. "Something?" Emma repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake just nodded, his eyes wide with fear. I looked around the clearing, trying to see any sign of Derek, but all I could see were the trees, looming over us like silent witnesses. "We need to find him," I said, though every instinct in my body was screaming to get out of those woods. We split up, calling Derek's name, our voices getting more frantic with each passing minute. But the more we searched, the more I felt like we weren't alone. There was something in those woods with us, watching us, waiting. The shadows between the trees seemed to move, shifting in ways that didn't make sense. After what felt like hours, we found him. He was standing by the river, facing away from us, his back rigid, his hands hanging limply at his sides. Relief flooded through me for a brief moment until he turned around. The person standing in front of us wasn't Derek. At least, not the Derek we knew. His face was pale, his eyes wide and empty, as if they'd seen something no one should ever see. His clothes were torn, his skin covered in scratches and bruises, but it was his smile that froze me in place. It wasn't a normal smile. It was too wide, too forced, like someone was pulling the corners of his mouth up against his will. "Derek?" I called out, my voice shaking. He didn't answer. He just stared at us, that unnerving smile plastered on his face, his eyes vacant and hollow. Jake stepped forward. "Derek, man, what happened? Where did you go?" Derek's head tilted to the side, like he was trying to understand the question. And then, without a word, he turned and walked into the river. We watched in stunned silence as he waded deeper and deeper, the water rising up to his chest, then his neck, then over his head. He never came back up. We just stood there, frozen, watching as Derek disappeared beneath the dark, still water. No one moved. No one spoke. It was like our brains couldn't process what had just happened. Derek was gone. but it felt unreal, like a nightmare we'd wake up from any second. Should we go in after him? Emma whispered, her voice trembling. None of us answered. I think we all knew deep down that there was nothing we could do. Derek wasn't coming back. And the worst part, I wasn't even sure that was Derek anymore. We need to leave, I finally said, my voice shaking. Now. Liv nodded, her face pale and her hands clutching her arms like she was trying to hold herself together. Jake was still staring at the river, his face blank, as if his mind had shut down completely. But just as we were about to turn and leave, something caught my eye. The water, where Derek had vanished, began to ripple. Slowly, at first, like someone had dropped a pebble into the river. But then the ripples grew larger, more violent, as if something huge was thrashing beneath the surface. I backed up, my heart racing. What is that? The others turned to look, their eyes wide with fear. The water churned, swelling faster and faster, but nothing came up. Nothing broke the surface. It was just chaos, like the river itself was alive. We need to go, I said again, more urgently this time. We can't stay here. We turned and ran, not caring about the path, not caring about anything but getting away from that river, and whatever had taken Derek. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees twisting and bending in ways that didn't make sense, as if they were trying to trap us. Branches scratched at our skin, roots tripped us up, but we didn't stop. When we finally burst out of the woods and into the parking lot where we'd left our cars, it was like we were escaping from another world. The night was still, the air cool and calm, but it felt wrong, like something had followed us out. We piled into Jake's car and he sped away, not saying a word. No one did. What could we say? We had lost Derek, and we couldn't explain how or why. The next day, I thought about going to the police. I thought about telling them what happened, but how could I? What would I even say? Our friend vanished in the woods, and when we found him, he wasn't human anymore. They'd think we were crazy. Hell, maybe we were crazy. Maybe the woods had done something to our minds. But I knew, deep down, I knew that what we'd seen was real. Derek was gone, and it was our fault. Days turned into weeks, and the town eventually moved on. They assumed Derek had run away or gotten lost, and the search parties stopped. But I couldn't forget. None of us could. I started seeing him. At first, it was just little things. A glimpse of him out of the corner of my eye, standing in the shadows. But when I turned to look, he'd be gone. I thought it was my imagination, guilt playing tricks on me. But then Liv saw him too. We were sitting in her living room one night, trying to distract ourselves with a movie, when she suddenly went pale. What's wrong? I asked. She didn't answer. She just pointed to the window. I turned, and there he was, Derek, standing outside in the yard, staring at us with that same eerie smile, his clothes still wet and torn, his eyes empty. We both screamed, and when Jake ran in from the kitchen, Derek was gone. He's following us, Liv whispered, her voice shaking. He's still out there. It wasn't long before Emma and Jake saw him too. He would appear outside their windows, in the shadows of their homes, always watching, always smiling. But he never spoke, he never moved, just watched. I thought about leaving town, about getting as far away from that forest as possible, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Derek wasn't bound to the woods anymore. He was with us, always with us. The night it all ended, I was alone in my room, trying to sleep when I heard it. The sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and they were coming from inside the house. My heart raced as I sat up, my eyes scanning the dark room. Derek? I whispered, though I didn't expect an answer. The footsteps stopped outside my door. I stared at the handle, frozen in place. For a moment, there was silence, and I hoped, maybe he was gone. But then the door creaked open, just a crack, and there he was. Derek stood in the doorway, his head tilted to the side, that unnatural smile still plastered on his face. His eyes were wide, unblinking, fixed on me. I wanted to scream to run, but I couldn't move. You should have left me, he said, his voice low and distorted, like it was coming from deep underwater. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could do was stare at him, my body frozen in fear. You should have left me in the woods, he repeated, stepping closer. His face, his once familiar face, began to twist and distort, his features stretching and warping like melted wax. His smile grew wider, his eyes darker, until he didn't look like Derek at all. He looked like something else, something inhuman. And then, just as quickly as he appeared, he was gone. The door was closed, and I was alone in the dark, gasping for breath. I never told anyone about that night. None of us did, but we all knew. We all felt it, that Derek wasn't gone. Not really. He was still with us, still watching, still waiting. And I knew one day he would come back for all of us. That was the last night I saw him, but it won't be the last. I've always been an average guy, living an average life. I never expected anything unusual to happen to me. But that changed one evening when I was flipping through an old photo album. I'd never paid much attention to my old pictures, the kind where I was goofing around with friends or posing with my family at events. But this time, something caught my eye. In the background of one photo, taken at my 21st birthday party, there was a man. He was just standing there, not blending in with the crowd, staring directly at the camera. I didn't remember him. He wasn't anyone I recognized, and I was pretty sure I knew everyone at that party. At first, I thought it was just a weird coincidence, maybe a friend of a friend. But as I flipped through more photos from that day, the man was in all of them. He was always standing in the background, never interacting with anyone, and no one seemed to notice him. The odd thing was that I hadn't noticed him either until now. Curiosity pushed me to dig through more albums, and there he was again. The same man appeared in photos from my childhood. At my 8th birthday, during a family trip to the beach, and even in photos from a school play when I was 12. He was always there, in the background, a blur to anyone who wasn't looking for him. I couldn't shake it off. It wasn't possible for the same man to appear in pictures taken years apart without aging. It just wasn't. But there he was, always wearing the same dark coat, the same blank expression. The more I looked, the more unsettled I became. I asked my parents and friends if they remembered the man in the photos, but no one did. It was like I was the only one who could see him. Things escalated when I found a picture of myself as a toddler in my mom's arms. He was in that one too. I froze when I realized he had been following me my whole life, always lurking in the background. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him. His face, expressionless, staring right at me from the corners of my mind. I convinced myself I was overthinking it. Maybe it was some kind of glitch or anomaly in the photos. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I started avoiding my camera. I didn't take pictures. I didn't even want to look at the old ones anymore. But that didn't stop him. The more I ignored it, the more persistent he became. One evening, I decided to test something. I went out for a walk, bringing my phone with me, even though I was terrified of what I might see. As I walked through the park, I snapped a few pictures, my hands trembling the entire time. When I got home and checked the photos, there he was, standing just a few feet behind me, in the exact same spot in every picture. I dropped my phone. This wasn't just some coincidence. He was following me. I didn't leave my apartment for days after that. I couldn't bear the thought of him being out there following me. Every sound outside my door made my heart race. I was becoming paranoid, convinced that he was always near, even when I wasn't taking pictures. Every time I glanced out the window or looked down the hallway, I half expected to see him standing there, just watching. It wasn't long before I started dreaming about him. The dreams were vague but chilling. I'd be somewhere familiar, a park, my office, a childhood home, and he would always be there, just standing, staring at me. No matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape him. His presence loomed over me even when I woke up, leaving me in a state of panic that I couldn't shake. Eventually, I did what anyone in my position would do. I went online, searching for answers. I combed through countless forums and obscure websites, hoping to find someone who had experienced something similar. But the more I searched, the more isolated I felt. There were no stories like mine. No one else had seen this man in their photos. No one else had been haunted in this way. I felt utterly alone. Then I found something, an old post on an abandoned message board. It was vague, written years ago by someone claiming to see an uninvited guest in their pictures. The post was short and cryptic, but one detail caught my attention. They mentioned that the man got closer with each picture. My blood ran cold. I hadn't noticed it before, but I had to check. I pulled out my phone again and opened the pictures I had taken in the park. I swiped through them, and sure enough, in each photo, he was a little closer. At first, he had been standing far behind me, blending into the shadows of the trees. But by the last photo, he was just a few feet away, almost as if he was about to reach out. I wanted to scream. This was real. This was happening, and I had no idea how to stop it. In desperation, I started going through every photo I could find, tracing his movement over the years. He wasn't always there, but when he was always inching closer. From distant figures in childhood pictures to being right behind me in the more recent ones. It was like he was closing in on me, step by step. Then one night, I made the biggest mistake. I was sitting alone in my living room, a glass of whiskey in hand, trying to calm my nerves. I hadn't looked at a photo in days, hoping that if I ignored it, maybe it would stop. But the curiosity was too much. I unlocked my phone and snapped a selfie just to see. When I looked at the picture, my stomach dropped. He wasn't in the background this time. He was right behind me, standing in the doorway, his face as expressionless as ever. But now, for the first time, his hand was reaching out toward my shoulder. I bolted out of the chair, spinning around to face the door, but there was no one there. My apartment was empty, but I could feel him. It was like the air had changed, colder, heavier. I ran to the bedroom, locking the door behind me, my heart pounding. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't stay in my apartment, but I couldn't leave either. The thought of seeing him outside, of knowing he was just out there waiting for me, made my skin crawl. I didn't sleep that night. I kept staring at the door, half expecting it to open, for him to step inside. By morning, I was exhausted and shaken, but the daylight brought some small comfort. I needed help. I called my best friend, Mark, and begged him to come over. When Mark arrived, I showed him the pictures, explaining everything that had been happening. He looked at me like I was losing my mind. "Dude, there's no one in these photos," he said, his tone almost condescending. I grabbed the phone from his hand. "What are you talking about? He's right there. Look." I swiped through the pictures, showing him every single one. But no matter how much I pointed, he just shook his head. "There's nothing there, man. You've been under a lot of stress lately. Maybe you're just seeing things." I wanted to scream at him, but I knew it wouldn't help. He couldn't see him. No one could. I pushed him out the door soon after, my frustration boiling over. Mark didn't get it. He didn't believe me. No one would. I was on my own. That evening, I resolved to do something. Anything. I couldn't live like this. I decided to take one last photo, a final attempt to capture whatever this was. I set up my camera, sat in my chair, and pressed the timer. As the camera clicked, I braced myself. When the picture appeared on the screen, my heart stopped. He wasn't in the doorway anymore. He was sitting next to me. His face inches from mine, staring directly into the lens. His hand was resting on my shoulder, and his cold, lifeless eyes bored into me. I dropped the camera, backing away from the chair. I could feel him now, his presence overwhelming, suffocating. I knew then that it didn't matter if I took any more pictures. He was already here. I tried to leave, but my legs felt heavy, like they were stuck in quicksand. I couldn't move. My breath hitched in my throat, panic clawing at my chest. I knew I had to get out, but it was too late. I heard a whisper, faint and distant, but unmistakable. "You've seen me now." The room grew colder, the shadows lengthening around me. My vision blurred, my head spinning as the weight of his presence crushed me from all sides. I stumbled toward the door, but it slammed shut on its own. Trapped. Then I saw him. Not in a photo, not behind me. He was standing right there, inches away, his expressionless face, his dead eyes. And for the first time he smiled. I never left that room. I don't know how long it's been, but I can feel him everywhere now. I can't take any more pictures because I already know what they would show. I'm not alone anymore. He's always with me. And soon, he'll be with you too. I didn't think much of it when the music box arrived in the mail. It came in a simple brown package, wrapped with care but no return address. My grandmother had passed away a month ago, and somehow receiving something from her now felt comforting. The moment I saw the delicate engravings on the box, I knew it was hers. It was her style, her taste, It almost felt like a final goodbye. The box was small, just big enough to fit in the palm of my hand. It was made of old, polished wood with intricate carvings of flowers and vines. In the center was a small key, but I couldn't find any way to wind it up. There was no note, just the box, as if that was all I needed to understand. At first, I placed it on my bedside table. It became part of the room, just another piece of nostalgia reminding me of the days when I'd sit on my grandmother's lap while she told me stories. But then things started to change. The first night I heard it, I thought I was dreaming. A soft, lilting melody filled the room, almost like a lullaby. I sat up in bed, the darkness wrapping around me like a blanket. The clock on the wall blinked 12 o'clock, midnight. The music was coming from the box. It was playing, but I hadn't touched it. The lid was slightly ajar, as though an invisible hand had opened it. The tune was familiar, one I had heard 100 times before. It was a song my grandmother used to hum when she was deep in thought, the same one that played from her own music box. I tried to ignore it, telling myself it was just a mechanical quirk, maybe a timer I hadn't noticed. But deep down, I knew better. The next night, the same thing happened. At exactly midnight, the music began to play. This time, I stayed awake, waiting for it, as if to catch it in the act. The air in the room felt heavier, like something was pressing down on me, and my skin prickled with unease. The music started slowly, softly, and I watched in disbelief as the box opened on its own. By the third night, I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the box, waiting, dreading. And like clockwork, it began to play again. The melody seemed different now, less soothing, more urgent. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and goosebumps spread across my arms. There was something wrong with this, with the box, with everything. That night, I had a nightmare. I dreamt of my grandmother, but she wasn't the way I remembered her. Her eyes were hollow, and her skin was pale, almost translucent. She was sitting in her old rocking chair, clutching the music box to her chest. "It's yours now," she whispered, her voice echoing like a distant wind. "Take care of it." I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The music was still playing, soft and haunting. I wanted to throw the box out, to get rid of it, but something inside me wouldn't let me. It was like a part of her was still here, tied to that box. The days passed, and the music continued every night at midnight, like a curse I couldn't escape. It played even when I wasn't in the room, as if it didn't care whether I was listening or not. The melody twisted, growing darker, more dissonant. It was as though the box had a life of its own, a story it was trying to tell me. I began to notice other things too. Shadows moved in the corners of my room, just beyond the reach of the light. The air felt colder at night, almost freezing. And then there was the voice. It started softly, barely a whisper. At first, I thought I was imagining it, the result of sleepless nights and too many nightmares. But it grew louder each time the music played. "Come closer," it would say, a voice that was both familiar and strange. It sounded like my grandmother, but not quite. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the box, waiting for the music to start. When it did, I reached out and lifted the lid completely. The music stopped abruptly, leaving the room in a suffocating silence. And that's when I saw it. Inside the box was a photograph, one I had never seen before. It was a picture of me as a child, sitting on my grandmother's lap, smiling. But there was something wrong with it. In the background, behind us, was a shadowy figure, barely visible but undeniably there. My heart raced as I picked up the photo. I could feel the weight of something unseen pressing against me, like I wasn't alone in the room. The voice returned, clearer now. "She's watching," it whispered. "She's always watching." I dropped the photograph back into the box, my hands trembling. The voice didn't stop. It seemed to echo through the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. I couldn't understand it, couldn't make sense of what was happening. Was I losing my mind? Was this all in my head? The music started again, louder this time, filling the room with that haunting melody. It was more than just a song now, it felt like a warning. I grabbed the box and shoved it into the bottom of my closet, hoping that out of sight would mean out of mind. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't help. I could feel the music, even in the silence. That night, the dream returned. My grandmother was there again, sitting in her chair, clutching the music box. But this time, she wasn't whispering. She was crying, tears streaming down her face. "I'm sorry," she kept saying, over and over. "I'm so sorry." I tried to approach her, to comfort her, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, watching helplessly as the room around her darkened. The shadows from the photograph began to move, swirling like smoke, creeping closer to her. Her crying grew louder, more desperate. And then, in a voice that didn't belong to her, she said, "It's coming for you." I woke up gasping, the air in my room thick with cold. The music was playing again, but this time it wasn't coming from the closet. It was coming from right next to me. I turned my head slowly, terrified of what I might see. And there, sitting on my bedside table, was the music box. But I had put it away. I was sure of it. How did it get back here? I sat up, my heart racing, and grabbed the box again. My hands shook as I carried it out of my room and down the stairs. I wasn't just going to put it in the closet this time. I was going to get rid of it for good. I ran out into the yard, the cold night air biting at my skin. Without thinking, I threw the music box into the trash bin and slammed the lid shut. That should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. At exactly midnight, I woke up to the sound of the music again. Faint, but unmistakable. I didn't understand. How could it still be playing? I had thrown it away. I forced myself out of bed, my legs heavy with dread, and walked outside to the trash bin. Slowly, I lifted the lid. The music box was gone. Panic surged through me. I looked around the yard, but there was no sign of it. The trash bin was empty, but the music still played, louder now, echoing all around me. I stumbled back inside, locking the door behind me as if that would somehow keep the nightmare out. That night, I didn't sleep. The music didn't stop. It played over and over, relentless, like it was trying to tell me something I didn't want to hear. And then the voice returned. "You can't run." It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was loud, clear, as if someone was standing right next to me, breathing those words into my ear. I spun around, but there was no one there. Just the shadows, moving in the corners of the room, growing darker, thicker. And then I saw it, the figure from the photograph, standing at the foot of my bed. I froze. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, its shape barely human, like a shadow given form. My heart pounded in my chest as the figure slowly raised a hand and pointed at me. The music grew louder, almost deafening, and then the voice spoke again, this time in a low, menacing tone. "It's time." The room seemed to close in on me, the walls pressing tighter as the shadows swirled closer. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. And then the music stopped. Everything went silent. For a moment, I thought it was over. I thought I was safe. But then I heard it, a creaking sound, soft at first, but growing louder, like old floorboards bending under the weight of something heavy. Slowly, I turned my head toward the door. And there, standing in the doorway, was my grandmother. But it wasn't her, not really. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stared straight through me. She was holding the music box, cradling it in her arms like it was the most precious thing in the world. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. I wanted to scream, but no sound came from me either. She stepped closer, her movements slow, deliberate. The music box began to play again, the same haunting melody filling the room. She stopped at the foot of my bed, her eyes never leaving mine, and then, in a voice that didn't belong to her, she said, "It's your turn now." The shadows closed in around me, suffocating, pulling me down into the darkness. I could feel them crawling over my skin, whispering things I couldn't understand. The last thing I saw before everything went black was my grandmother's hollow eyes, staring down at me as the music played on. I woke up in a hospital bed, the sterile white walls and the beeping of machines around me doing little to soothe the terror that clung to me. I didn't remember how I got here, but I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't alone. The nurse came in and smiled warmly, but it didn't reach her eyes. She placed something on the bedside table, something that made my blood run cold. I didn't expect the invitation to land in my mailbox. Handwritten, elegant, with a wax seal like something from an old movie. The invitation felt so personal, yet I had no idea who it was from. It was addressed to me, carefully scrawled in neat, looping handwriting. "You are cordially invited to a celebration of old friends at Crestwood Mansion. 8 p.m. Saturday. The name made my skin crawl. Crestwood Mansion. I had heard of it before. It had been abandoned for years, hidden deep in the forest just outside the town. It was the kind of place people made up stories about, warning kids not to go there because of the accidents and the shadows seen at the windows late at night. But the invitation was too tempting. Something about it pulled me in, curiosity, maybe, or the allure of something unknown. Besides, a party of old friends sounded oddly welcoming, despite the cold feeling in my gut. When I arrived, I immediately regretted it. The mansion loomed ahead, its dark windows like hollow eyes staring back at me. The iron gate creaked open with no effort, and as I stepped inside, a rush of cold air met me. I could hear the trees behind me whispering as the wind blew through them, but there was no sound from the house. No music, no chatter, nothing. I made my way to the front door, a massive wooden thing with a brass knocker. I knocked twice, waiting, but no one answered. The silence was suffocating. Then, with a faint creak, the door slowly opened on its own. I stepped inside, and the smell hit me first, damp wood and something else, something faintly metallic, like blood. The chandelier above flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the dusty floor. The house seemed frozen in time. The furniture was draped in white sheets, and the portraits on the wall stared down at me, their eyes too intense, too focused. "Hello," I called out, my voice echoing back at me. I walked farther into the mansion, my footsteps the only sound. There was no sign of a party, no decorations, no lights, just darkness and the faint smell of decay. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a figure darting down the hallway. My heart leaped into my throat, but something made me follow. I turned the corner, and the hallway stretched on forever, lined with doors. I tried the first one on the left. It opened with a groan, revealing an empty room with a single chair in the middle, facing a mirror. The second room was similar, empty, cold, lifeless. I moved to the next door and paused, my hand shaking as I gripped the knob. When I opened it, the smell of death hit me full force. Bodies, lined up on the floor like dolls, their skin gray, their eyes wide open but unseeing. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. What was this? I recognized some of them, faces I hadn't seen in years. Faces of people I went to school with, people I had lost touch with, people who had died. I ran out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to know anymore, but the house wasn't done with me. The doors began to open on their own, revealing more corpses. All familiar faces, all friends, all dead. Then I understood, the invitation wasn't for a party with old friends. It was a reunion of the dead, and I was the only one still breathing. Panic overtook me. I ran through the house, desperate to find a way out, but the front door was locked. The windows were barred. The mansion itself had trapped me. I was surrounded by the dead, and their eyes were following me, unblinking, watching. Suddenly, the house seemed to groan as if waking from a long slumber. The air thickened, and a cold presence filled the room. It was no longer just the dead bodies around me. There was something else, something darker, watching me waiting. I could hear whispers, soft at first, then louder, until they were deafening. "Join us," they said. "You belong here." I ran, but there was nowhere to go. The house stretched on forever, every room filled with the dead. And then, finally, I found the last room. The one room I hadn't opened. Inside, there was a coffin. With trembling hands, I lifted the lid. And there, lying in the coffin, was me. The sight of myself lying in the coffin drained all the strength from my body. I froze, staring down at my own face, pale, lifeless, eyes closed as if in a deep, eternal sleep. The air around me grew impossibly cold, my breath visible in short, panicked puffs. My legs gave out beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor beside the coffin, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. How could this be me? I was still here, still alive, wasn't I? My heart hammered in my chest, but when I pressed a hand against it, the beat felt wrong. Sluggish, weak, as though my body, like the rest of the mansion, had begun to fade. The whispers grew louder, and now I could feel their breath on the back of my neck. "You belong here," they repeated, echoing through my skull like a cruel mantra. "You always belonged here." I shook my head, trying to push the voices away. I had to get out. I had to escape. But every door I had opened had led me deeper into this nightmare, and now the final truth lay before me. I was already dead, wasn't I? I just hadn't accepted it yet. I looked down at my hands. They were shaking, but more than that, they were pale. Too pale. My skin had taken on the same greyish hue as the bodies I had seen. A sinking dread filled me. I felt hollow, as if the very essence of life was draining out of me, seeping into the mansion itself. No, I whispered to myself. No, this can't be happening. But it was. The walls seemed to close in on me, the shadows growing darker, more solid, almost like figures taking form around me. I could feel their presence, cold and menacing, as though they were waiting for me to finally realize what I had tried so hard to deny. You were always meant to join us, one voice said, low and rasping. I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty room and the endless, suffocating darkness. I stumbled to my feet, my breath ragged, and bolted for the door. The hallway stretched out before me, impossibly long, the lights flickering as I ran. My legs felt heavy, sluggish, as though I was wading through thick mud, and no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't seem to get any closer to the exit. The whispers followed me, relentless now, echoing in every corner of the house. You belong here. Stay with us. I rounded a corner, desperate for an escape, and found myself back in the grand foyer where I had entered. The front door stood just a few feet away, and for the first time, it seemed open, just a crack, enough to offer a glimmer of hope. My heart leaped. I sprinted toward it, my hand outstretched, but as I reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang that echoed through the mansion. I cried out in frustration, pounding my fists against the door, but it wouldn't budge. The house had sealed me in. Behind me, the whispers grew louder, closer. The shadows shifted, forming vague, humanoid shapes that moved toward me with a terrifying calmness. I pressed my back against the door, my pulse racing, but I knew it was over. There was nowhere left to run. You've always been one of us, the voices said in unison, surrounding me, suffocating me. I closed my eyes, willing myself to wake up, to escape this nightmare, but deep down, I knew the truth. I had been dead long before I arrived at Crestwood Mansion. This invitation, it was just the final step. I belonged here. A cold hand gripped my shoulder, and I jolted in terror. The shadows had taken form now, faces twisted into grotesque versions of people I once knew. Their eyes glowed with a sickly light as they closed in around me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat felt tight, as if the very air had been stolen from my lungs. And then suddenly, I felt it, the stillness, the final surrender. My body seemed to go limp, my mind detached, floating away from the terror that had consumed me. The whispers grew softer, fading into the background until there was only silence. I opened my eyes, but I wasn't in the foyer anymore. I stood in a dark, endless void, surrounded by nothing but empty space. And there, in the distance, I saw it, my reflection, walking toward me, its expression cold, indifferent. You were always meant to join us, it said, its voice eerily calm. You just took a little longer to realize it. I tried to move, but my body wouldn't respond. I was frozen, trapped in this limbo between life and death, between reality and the mansion's twisted version of it. The reflection reached out and touched my face, its hand icy and weightless, and as it did, I felt my last connection to the world of the living slip away. In the end, the mansion hadn't killed me. It had simply reminded me of what I had forgotten. I was never truly alive to begin with. And now, I would stay here, forever. As my reflection's icy hand touched my face, everything around me began to shift. The mansion, the hallway, the whispers, they all dissolved into a swirling, endless blackness. I stood alone, weightless, suspended in some void where time and space no longer existed. My body felt foreign, almost as though I no longer inhabited it. I struggled to remember who I was, where I had been, what had happened. My name, what was my name? It felt so distant, like something I had once known, but had long since forgotten. You've always belonged here, the voice whispered again, this time not from outside of me, but from within. It was my own voice, echoing through my mind. I tried to resist, to cling to whatever fragment of reality I could hold on to, but my thoughts were slipping away. The truth, as horrifying as it was, became clear. I was already part of this place. I had been from the moment I set foot inside the mansion, maybe even long before that. With a jolt, I was pulled back, and the dark void around me faded, replaced by the familiar sight of the mansion's grand foyer. I stood before the same door I had tried to escape from earlier. The heavy wooden frame seemed to mock me with its silence. This time, however, I wasn't pounding on it. I stood still, calm, accepting. I turned away from the door and faced the shadows that now filled the room. I could see them clearly, figures of people I had once known, people whose bodies I had seen in the rooms upstairs. Their faces were twisted in a grotesque blend of sorrow and anger, but their eyes glowed with the same strange light I had seen in my reflection. I took a step forward, feeling no fear now. The panic, the desperation, it was all gone. This was my place. This was where I belonged. Why? I asked, my voice surprisingly steady. Why me? One of the figures stepped forward, its face eerily familiar. It was a friend from long ago, someone I had lost contact with, someone I hadn't thought about in years. His face twisted into a smile, but there was no warmth in it, just the cold, hollow grin of someone who had been consumed by this place. You were always part of this, he said. His voice was raspy, as though it hadn't been used in years. You just didn't know it yet. I wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but deep down I already knew. The invitation, the mansion, the sense of familiarity that had haunted me from the moment I arrived, it was all part of something much bigger, something I had unknowingly been drawn into. I took another step forward, and the shadows closed in around me, their whispers growing softer, almost welcoming. They weren't hostile anymore. They weren't trying to scare me. They were inviting me, welcoming me into their world, into the place I had always belonged. And then I saw it, the coffin. It stood in the center of the room now, illuminated by a faint, ghostly light. The lid was still open, and inside my own lifeless body lay as still as ever, waiting for me to accept what I had been fighting against. With slow, deliberate steps, I approached the coffin. The shadows watched, their glowing eyes fixed on me, but they made no move to stop me. They didn't need to. As I reached the coffin, I looked down at my body, my face pale and cold, my hands folded neatly across my chest. It looked peaceful in a way that was almost comforting. I felt the pull again, the strange sensation that I was no longer tethered to the world I had once known. My reflection's words echoed in my mind, "You belong here." With a deep breath, I stepped into the coffin. The lid slowly closed over me, sealing me inside the darkness. And in that final moment, as the last sliver of light disappeared, I understood. I was home. The mansion no longer felt cold or empty. I was no longer alone. I had become part of it, part of the very fabric of its existence, just like the others who had come before me. The shadows that had once terrified me now felt like old friends, and the whispers that had chilled my soul now offered comfort. There was no escape, no running from the truth. The party wasn't for the living, it was for those who had passed on, those who had been drawn to the mansion and trapped within its walls. And now, I was one of them. In the stillness of death, I realized there was no need to fight anymore. I had finally accepted my fate. The mansion had claimed me. And as the years passed, as more invitations were sent out and more guests arrived, I would be there to greet them, to welcome them into the fold. Because in the end, everyone who came to Crestwood Mansion was already dead. They just didn't know it yet.